upon a dedicated mechanism to attribute responsibility for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, end of quote, following the end of the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, or JIM. I want to repeat today that the norms against chemical weapons must be upheld. And as I wrote in the same letter, and I quote, "Ensuring accountability for a confirmed use of chemical weapons is our responsibility, not least to the victims of such attacks. A lack of accountability emboldens those who would use such weapons by providing them with the reassurance of impunity. This in turn further weakens the norm proscribing the use of chemical weapons and the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a whole. I urge all members to act responsibly in these dangerous circumstances. And I appeal to the Security Council to fulfill its duties and not give up on efforts to agree upon a dedicated, impartial, objective and independent mechanism for attributing responsibility with regard to the use of chemical weapons. I stand ready to support such efforts." End of quote. Increasing tensions and the inability to reach a compromise in the establishment of an accountability mechanism threaten to lead to a full-blown military escalation. In my contacts with you, especially with the permanent members of the Security Council, I have been reiterating my deep concerns about the risks of the current impasse and stressed the need to avoid the situation spiraling out of control. Mr. President, that is exactly the risk we face today, that things spiral out of control. It is our common duty to stop it. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing and the valuable information contained in which he shared with us. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his briefing. Your participation and your assessments and the authoritative word as to your authoritative word about the situation that has unfolded is of great significance. We concur with you. In the Middle East, there are many wounds. But presently, what is most important is the situation, the largest wound is the situation around Syria, insofar as the negative repercussions thereof are fraught with global repercussions. 2 days ago, the world received news flew around the world about a threat from the United States to conduct a strike against the Syrian Arab Republic. Warnings to prepare for this were also addressed to the Russian Federation. Let us recall that Syria, at the invitation of its legitimate government, has the presence of Russian troops deployed to combat international terrorism. We continue to observe dangerous military preparations to an illegal act of force against a sovereign state in what would constitute a breach of international law. Not only the use of force, but also the threat of force flies in the face of the United Nations Charter, and this is precisely what we have seen in recent rhetoric and action by Washington and its allies. Bellicose rhetoric is being ratcheted up at all levels, including at the highest levels, to Syria's shores, their additional forces and means of the U.S. Navy and that of their allies is nearing. It appears that Washington has adopted a categorical policy to unleash a military scenario against Syria. This cannot be tolerated. Such a development of events is fraught with grave repercussions for global security, especially in the light of the deployment in Syria of the Russian military contingent. There are those who, with tacit consent, are observing the dangerous preparations. They state that they understand Washington's motivations, and they are engaging in direct incitement, thereby possibly becoming complicit in a possible military misadventure. At the Security Council, there are those who enjoy engaging in discussions about preventive diplomacy. For some reason, we neither hear them nor see them presently. And immediately, not only prior to the investigation, but even prior to the establishment of the very fact that an incident occurred, guilty parties were identified,
которым предстоит, видимо, понести наказание.
And apparently they will have to be held accountable and punished.
За развитие событий по неблагоприятному сценарию придется отвечать, как и за предыдущие интервенции, погрузившие ряд стран на долгие годы в пучину кризиса и приведшие к неисчислимым жертвам.
Plunged many countries into lengthy years of crisis, an abyss of crisis, and untold casualties.
Перед глазами недавний опыт Ирака и Ливии.
We have the evident recent experience of Iraq and Libya before us.
Он, среди прочего, показывает, что к Совету Безопасности у американских партнеров сугубо потребительское отношение.
Have adopted a largely consumerist approach to the Security
Совет им
Council.
нужен как прикрытие иракских пробирок или ливийской бесполетной зоны.
For Iraq test tubes or the Libyan no-fly
Такую же
zone. That is what they
виртуальную,
need the council.
пустую
Such a
пробирку
virtual,
вы демонстрируете нам сейчас.
such a virtual empty test tube is what you are placing before us right now.
Безответственное поведение США, попирающих международное право и суверенитет государств, недостойно статуса постоянного члена Совета Безопасности ООН. Недостойно для статуса постоянного члена Совета Безопасности ООН. Он предполагает высочайшую ответственность, а не отсутствующее в Международном кодексе поведения право размахивать дубинкой. За что вы так терзаете Ближний Восток, провоцируя один конфликт за другим и натравливая региональные государства друг на друга? Кто выиграет от возможного удара по сирийским военным, несущим основное бремя борьбы с терроризмом, с террористами и добившимся серьезных побед в этом отношении? Нам точно известно, что главарям сирийских вооруженных группировок отданы приказы начать наступление после возможной силовой акции. Неужели очередной виток хаоса затевается только ради этого?
Is the latest wave of chaos truly being unleashed only for the sake of that?
Предлог — предполагаемое применение отравляющих веществ в сирийском городе Дума 7 апреля. Достоверных подтверждений этому нет. Наши специалисты не нашли никаких следов использования отравляющих веществ. Жителям Думы об атаке неизвестно. Все сведения о якобы произошедшей атаке предоставлены антиправительственными силами, заинтересованными в подобном развитии событий.
Such a development of events.
У нас есть веские основания полагать, более того, даже есть информация, полагать, что имело место провокация с участием спецслужб некоторых стран. Мы об этом давно предупреждали. Это повторение сценария Хан Шейхуна в апреле прошлого года. Сирийское правительство, которому, очевидно, все это надо в последнюю очередь, заявило о своей непричастности и направила запрос о срочном проведении инспекции на предполагаемом месте происшествия силами ОСХО. Совместно с российскими военными предоставила гарантии безопасности. Миссия уже приступает к работе в Сирии, рассчитывая, что она сможет обеспечить подлинно независимый и беспристрастный характер расследования. Только Совет Безопасности имеет полномочия на международном уровне принимать решения о том, какие меры и в отношении кого могут быть приняты в связи с использованием химического оружия в Сирии.
in Syria.
Россия продолжает усиленно и планомерно работать
continues to
над
work
деэскалацией
robustly and fully
напряженности,
to
возникшей в
de-escalate
последнее
the
время в
tensions that
международных
have
отношениях.
recently arisen in international
Мы
relations.
предложили принять
We
краткую резолюцию
proposed a
Совета
brief resolution of the
Безопасности в
Security Council be
поддержку
adopted in
инспекции
support
миссии ОСХО в
for
Думе.
the inspection of the OPS
Однако
delegate
она была
inspection mission in
безответственно
Duma.
заблокирована
However,
США,
it was
Великобританией и
irresponsibly
Францией.
blocked by the US, the UK, and France.
Таким образом, эти
Thereby,
страны
these
продемонстрировали
countries have demonstrated the
незаинтересованность в
fact that they have
расследовании.
no interest in an investigation.
Единственная
The sole thing
заинтересованность —
that they have an
свержение
interest
сирийского
in is
правительства,
to
а в
oust
более
the
широком
Syrian government
контексте
and, more broadly,
сдерживание России.
to deter and contain the Russian Federation.
Это отчетливо прослеживается и в
This has
других
been
международных и
clearly seen in other
внутриполитических
international
сюжетах,
and
строящихся
domestic
на
political
мистификациях и
subjects,
теориях
which are
заговора,
based on
в
mystifications
центр
and
которого вы
conspiracy
каждый раз
theories, at the
голословно
heart
помещаете
of
Россию.
which each time you baselessly place the Russian Federation.
Чего вы добиваетесь?
What are you trying to
После
achieve
многолетней
following
междоусобицы в Сирии
the
удалось
lengthy
стабилизировать
difficulties
значительные районы
in
этой
clashes
страны.
in Syria? Large parts of that country have
Поддерживается
been
на плаву
stabilized.
политический
The
процесс.
political process is now
Появляются
afloat.
ростки национального примирения.
Indicators of national reconciliation are coming to the fore.
Нанесен
There has
существенный
been a
урон
significant
террористам.
blow dealt to terrorists.
Мы никогда не
We have never
отрицали,
denied
что вы тоже
that
внесли определенный
you
вклад в
too
выполнение
made a
этой
certain
общей для всех
contribution
задачи.
to achievement of this common objective.
Но определенные породы
However,
террористов всегда
certain
приберегались
types
вами
of
для
terrorists
борьбы
have
с
always been
режимом
sheltered by you to
и
combat the
продвижения
regime
своих
and
геополитических
for you to
приоритетов в регионе.
advance your geopolitical priorities in the region.
Британская коллега все время
Our British
спрашивает меня,
colleague
что делает
constantly asks
Россия для
me, what is Russia
выполнения
doing
резолюции
to see
2401
to
Совета
the implementation
Безопасности.
of Security Council Resolution 2401?
Отвечаю.
I will
Моя
respond.
страна является
My
едва ли не
country
единственной,
is almost the
которая этим
only
занимается.
party to be
За
doing
время
this.
существования Астанинского процесса удалось
Over the
заменить
course of the
более
existence of the
2500
Astana process, more than
населенных пунктов.
2,500 residential areas saw peace brought to them as a result
Это
of
не
our
означает,
efforts.
что
This
они
does
стали
not
жертвой,
mean that
как
they
вы
became
выражаетесь, режима.
victims, as you say it, of the regime, as you
Просто с
say
помощью
it.
России и
With the
других
assistance
гарантов
of
они
Russia
наладили
and other
нормальные отношения
guarantors,
с
they have
центральными властями
established a
Дамаска.
normal relationship with the central
В
authorities
Сочи
in
был организован и
Damascus. In
успешно проведен при
Sochi, what was
поддержке ООН Конгресс
organized and
Сирийского
successfully
национального диалога.
conducted with UN support was a Syrian National Dialogue Congress.
А сколько городов и сел
How many
замерили
cities,
вы?
how many towns have you
Сколько
introduced
группировок
peace
вы
to?
убедили
How
присоединиться к
many groups
договоренностям о
have you
прекращении огня?
persuaded to join ceasefire agreements?
Для
In
разблокирования
order to
ситуации
break
в
the
Восточной
deadlock
Гуте с
in the
момента
situation
принятия
in Eastern
резолюции
Ghouta since the adoption
2401
of
с
Resolution
лидерами вооруженных
2401,
группировок
with the leaders
при
of armed groups,
содействии России
with
проводились
Russia's
сложнейшие
assistance,
переговоры.
painstaking negotiations were held.
Боевиков и членам их семьи
The
удалось
fighters
в
and members
полной
of their family
безопасности
were able
вывести из
to,
этого
with
района.
full conditions of safety and security, to be evacuated from
Мирные
that
жители
area.
наконец получили
Civilians
возможность
finally
избавиться
gained
от
an
многолетнего
opportunity
террора.
to cleanse themselves of many years of terrorism and rid
Посмотрите на
themselves
их
of such
неподдельную радость.
terrorism. And look at their unbounded joy.
Эти кадры есть.
There is this,
Просто
this
ваши СМИ
footage
их не
exists,
показывают.
but for some reason your media outlets are not showing it.
Вас не волновала судьба
You had no
узников боевиков
concern
Восточной
for
Гуте
the
из
fate
числа
of the
сторонников
hostages of
сирийского
fighters in
правительства.
Eastern Ghouta, those from among supporters of the Syrian government.
Боевики, ведя торг с властями об обмене пленными, убеждали, что
They're
удерживают
bargaining
от
with the
2 до
authorities
4
for an
тысяч
exchange
человек.
of hostages and said that they held 2,000 to 4,000
Теперь
people.
выясняется, что
And
их
now it is
намного
becoming
меньше.
clear that that number is far lower.
Люди погибли от
People
жестокого
died
обращения и
due
изнурительного
to
труда, роя
harsh
по приказу
treatment
своих
and
мучителей
difficult
огромные
labor
тоннели.
with digging enormous tunnels for their torturers.
Вы опечалены тем, что
You
ваши
lament the
бородатые
fact
питомцы
that
отправились в
your
бесплатное туристическое
bearded
путешествие по Сирии.
pilgrims were sent for free-of-charge tourist excursions into Syria.
Вы потеряли возможность
You
на
lost an
каждом углу кричать о
opportunity
сотнях тысяч
each
людей в
time
осажденной Восточной
to
Гуте.
cry about hundreds of thousands of people in the besieged Eastern Ghouta.
Теперь им нужно
Now
помогать
they
им
need to
устраивать
be
нормальные
helped
условия
in
жизни, но вам это уже не
restoring
интересно.
normal living conditions, but now you are no longer interested
Потому что
in
теперь
this.
территория
And that is
контролируется
because
правительством.
now that territory is under government
Теперь
control.
придется вести
Now it will be
неприятный для вас
necessary
разговор о блокаде
to
Фу и
engage in
Кафрая.
an inconvenient discussion for you on the blockade in Foix and Kafraya.
Когда там был последний гуманитарный
When
конвой?
did the last humanitarian convoy reach the area?
Когда вы последний раз
When
вообще этим
did you
интересовались?
even look into this? When was the last
Придется
time you even looked
отвечать за
into this?
разрушенную
It will be
коалицию Рака.
necessary to respond for and be held accountable for Raqqa, which was destroyed by the coalition. Mr. President,
события развиваются по опасному сценарию,
there is a dangerous
грозящему
development of
далеко
events
идущими последствиями
which
для
is
глобальной
fraught with
безопасности.
far-reaching ramifications for global security.
Вся ответственность в таком
And the
случае ляжет
full
на Соединенные Штаты
responsibility
Америки
in
и
this
союзников.
case will fall to the United States and their
Жаль,
allies. It
жаль,
is
что
most
продолжает терять лицо
unfortunate
старая Европа.
that old Europe continues to lose face.
Призываем
We
руководство
call
этих
upon the
государств
leadership of
немедленно
these
одуматься,
states
вернуться в
immediately to
международно-правовое поле
reconsider,
и не
to return to
подводить
the
мир к
international
опасной
legal
черте.
fold, and not to bring the world
Нужно
to such a
срочно искать
dangerous
мирный выход в рамках
threshold. It
коллективных
is
усилий.
necessary to urgently seek a peaceful settlement
Российская
through
Федерация
collective efforts.
готова
The
к
Russian Federation
равноправному
stands ready to
сотрудничеству
engage
со
in
всеми
equitable
партнерами и
cooperation
решению
with all
возникающих
partners
проблем путем
to
диалога.
resolve the problems which arise through dialogue.
Мы неизменно
We
нацелены на мирное
steadfastly
урегулирование
have
конфликта
focused
в
on a
Сирии
peaceful
на
settlement to the
известной
conflict
международной
in Syria
основе
on the well-known
и будем
international legal
продолжать
basis,
активные
and we shall
усилия в этом
continue our
направлении.
proactive efforts to this end.
Призываем к
We
этому всех.
call upon all to follow
Всех
suit,
наших партнеров.
all of our partners to
Благодарю
follow
вас.
suit. Thank you.
Le agradezco al
I thank
representante
the
de la Federación de
representative of the
Rusia
Russian
por su
Federation
declaración
for his
y
statement.
le doy la palabra
I give
a la
the floor to the
representante de los
representative
Estados
of the
Unidos.
United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I started to listen to my Russian friend and respond, but instead, I'm in awe, Vasily, of how you say what you say with a straight face. I really, really am. Today's session of the Security Council has been called under truly strange circumstances. The Russian Federation has asked us to discuss what it calls unilateral threats related to Syria. What is strange is that Russia is ignoring the real threat to international peace and security that has brought us all here. And it is ignoring its own unilateral responsibility for all of it. What we should discuss today is the use of deadly chemical weapons to murder innocent Syrian civilians. That is one of the most blatant and grotesque violations of international law in the world today. It is a violation of all standards of morality. It violates the long-standing international consensus that chemical weapons represent a unique evil. Chlorine, mustard gas, and other chemical weapons killed 90,000 people and injured over 1 million in World War I. In the book, Canada in the Great World War, the Canadian soldier, A.T. Hunter, described it like this, quote, "The gas cloud gathered itself like a wave and ponderously lapped over into the trenches. Then passive curiosity turned to active torment, a burning sensation in the head, red-hot needles in the lungs, the throat seized by a strangler. Many fell and died on the spot, the others gasping, stumbling, with faces contorted, hands wildly gesticulating and uttering hoarse cries of pain, fled madly through the villages and farms and through the city itself, carrying panic to the remnants of the civilian population and filling the roads with fugitives of both sexes and all ages." End quote. Chemical weapons didn't produce the most casualties in World War I, but they were the most feared. In World War II, chemical weapons were employed on an industrial scale against civilians, resulting in the worst genocide in human history, which we recalled just yesterday on Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is what brings us here today. That is what chemical weapons are all about. That is why we must not stay silent in the face of horrible chemical weapons use in our own time. The first response to all this death and injury was the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of chemical weapons in war. Later, in 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed. That convention obligates all of its parties to, quote, "never under any circumstances develop, produce, stockpile, transfer, or use chemical weapons." It also prohibits all parties from assisting anyone to engage in these activities. The United States is a party to this convention. Russia is a party to this convention. Every country that is a member of the United Nations Security Council is a party to this convention. Even the Assad regime has pledged to abide by the convention. So in theory, all of us agree on the core principle at stake today. No country can be allowed to use chemical weapons with impunity. Now that we have established what we all agree on, let's ask ourselves, what should we be condemning today? We should be discussing the actions that really brought us to this moment in time. We should not be condemning the country or group of countries that might actually have the courage to stand up in defense of our common principle, the principle against the use of chemical weapons. Instead, we should be condemning the country that unilaterally has stopped the Security Council from upholding this principle. Who is it on the Council that most exhibits unilateralism when it comes to chemical weapons? It is Russia alone that has stopped at nothing to defend the Syrian regime's multiple uses of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that killed the joint investigative mechanism which allowed the world to ensure accountability for chemical weapons use in Syria. It is Russia alone that used its veto 6 times to prevent the condemnation of Assad's use of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that used its veto 12 times to protect the Assad regime. And to make matters worse, it is Russia alone that had agreed to be the guarantor of the removal of all chemical weapons in Syria. If Russia had lived up to its commitment, there would be no chemical weapons in Syria, and we would not be here today. That is the Russian record of unilateralism. It is a record that has led to the trashing of all international standards against the use of chemical weapons. This meeting should not be about the so-called unilateral threats. It should be about the multiple actions Russia has taken to bring us to this point. Our president has not yet made a decision about possible actions in Syria. But should the United States and our allies decide to act in Syria, it will be in defense of a principle on which we all agree. It will be in defense of a bedrock international norm that benefits all nations. Let's be clear. Assad's most recent use of poison gas against the people of Douma was not his first, second, third, or even 49th use of chemical weapons. The United States estimates that Assad has used chemical weapons in the Syrian war at least 50 times. Public estimates are as high as 200. In the weeks after Assad's sarin gas attack last April that killed nearly 100 people, including many children, the regime used chlorine gas at least once and possibly as many as 3 times in the same area. Last November, just as the Joint Investigative Mechanism mandate expired, the regime attacked its people with sarin again in the Damascus suburbs. In January, Assad used at least 4 chlorine-filled rockets in Douma, and then he struck again last weekend. And thanks to Russia, there was no UN body to determine blame. But we know who did this. Our allies know who did this. Russia can complain all it wants about fake news, but no one is buying its lies and its cover-ups. Russia was supposed to guarantee that Assad wouldn't use chemical weapons, and Russia did the opposite. The world must not passively accept the use of chemical weapons after almost a century of their prohibition. Everything the United Nations stands for is being blatantly defied in Syria with the help of a permanent member of this council. All nations and all people will be harmed if we allow Assad to normalize the use of chemical weapons. It is those who act to violate the prohibition of chemical weapons who deserve our condemnation. Those who act to defend it deserve our support. The United States and our allies will continue to stand up for truth, accountability, justice, and an end to the use of chemical weapons. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante de los Estados Unidos por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de China.
Mr. President,
我感谢古特雷斯秘书长所做的通报，高度赞赏秘书长先生在中东及叙利亚问题上所做的不懈努力。
on the issues of the Middle East and that of Syria.
当前
At present,
叙利亚局势
the situation in
十分危
Syria
急，
is perilous.
正处于
It is
战与
at the
和的
crossroads
十字路
of
口。
war and peace.
中方对
China
形势发
is
展
following the
高度关
developments
注，
with great concern.
对紧张局势
The
可能升
possibility
级
of an
深
escalation
感
of
忧虑。
tensions worries us deeply.
当务之急
The pressing
是
priority
对
of the
有关
moment
事件
is to
展开
launch
全面、
a comprehensive,
客观、
objective,
公正的
and
调查，
impartial investigation
形成
into the
具有
relevant
权威性的
incidents
结论。
in order to arrive at authoritative conclusions.
中方一贯
China
坚持
has
和
consistently
平解决
stood
争端，
in favor of peaceful settlement of
反对
disputes and
在国际关系
opposed
中
to the
动辄使用
routine
武力
use of force
或者
or
威胁
threat
使
to
用
use
武力，
force in international relations.
绕开安理会采取
Unilaterally
单边军事行
taking
动，
military actions by
不符合
circumventing the
联合国
Security
宪章
Council
的
is
宗旨和
inconsistent
原则，
with the purposes and
有悖
principles of the
国
UN
际法
Charter and
和
runs
国际关系
counter
的
to
基
the
本准
basic
则。
norms enshrined in international law and those governing
叙利亚的
international
主权
relations.
独立、
Syria's
统
sovereignty,
一和
independence,
领土完
unity
整
and territorial
应该得到
integrity
充分
ought
的
to
尊重。
be fully respected.
我们呼吁
We
有关各
call
方
on the parties
保持
concerned
冷静
to
克
remain
制，
calm, exercise
避免
restraint,
采取
refrain
任
from
何可
any
能
move
导致局
that
势
may lead
进一
to
步
further
升级的举
escalation
动，
of the situation
通过协商与对
and
话
solve the
和平
issue
解决问题。
peacefully through consultation and dialogue.
中方坚信，
China is convinced that
军事手段
there is
解
no
决不了叙
military
利亚问题，
solution to the Syrian issue.
政治解
The
决
only way
是
out
叙利亚问题
is a
唯一出路。
political settlement.
中方
China
支持联
supports
合
the
国
UN
发
in
挥积
playing
极
an
作
active
用，
role in
维护
safeguarding
联合
the
国和安理
authority
会的
and the
权威
standing
和地
of the
位。
United Nations and its Security Council.
中方呼吁国际
China
社会
calls on the international community
继续
to
坚持
keep up
外交
its
努力不动
diplomatic
摇，
efforts without wavering,
坚持政
stay
治
the
解决
course
叙利
to
亚问题
settle the
不
Syrian
动
issue
摇，
politically without wavering,
充分发挥
give full
联合
play
国斡
to
旋
the
主
role
渠道
of
的
the
作用，
UN as the main
遵
mediator
照
and
安理会有关
settle
决议
the
精神，
Syrian issue
尽快全面、
comprehensively,
公正、
justly,
妥善地
and
解
properly
决叙利亚问
without
题。
delay, pursuant to the thrust of the relevant Security Council resolutions.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
世界人民
the people of the
渴望
world
和平，
yearn for
反对
peace.
战争。
They oppose war.
叙利亚
The
局势
situation
关
in
乎
Syria
中东地
bears
区
on
乃至世
peace
界
and stability
和
in
平
the Middle
与
East
稳定，
and the world at
关
large,
乎安理
and
会
it
的
bears on
信
the
誉与权
credibility
威。
and authority of the Security Council.
在此关键时刻，
At a crucial
安理
juncture
会
such as this
应
one,
承担起
the
联合国宪
Security
章
Council
赋予
should
的
rightfully
神圣
discharge
职责，
its sacred responsibility
顺应
emanating
时
from the
代
UN
潮
Charter,
流，
act in line
凝聚
with the
团
dictates
结
of our
共
times,
识，
build unity and
尽
consensus,
最大的努力
and do its
维护和平，
utmost to maintain
采
peace,
取一切措施
leave no
避
stone
免战争，
unturned to avoid war,
不辜负
and
国际
live
社会
up
的信
to
任
the
和
trust
期望。
and expectations of the international community.
中国
China
始终是
is
世界
and
和
has
平的
always
建设
been
者，
a builder of world
全球
peace,
发
a
展的贡献
contributor
者，
to global
国际秩
development
序
and
的
a
维护
defender
者。
of international order.
中方
China
愿
stands
本着对历
ready
史
to
负责，
continue
对
our
人民负责的
unflagging
精神，
effort to
继续
safeguard
为维
peace
护
and
中东
stability in the
及
Middle
世
East
界的和
and the
平与
world
稳
at
定
large in the spirit
做
of
出
being
不懈的
responsible
努
to
力。
history and
谢谢
being
主席先生。
responsible to the people of the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al
I
representante
thank
de
the
China por su
representative of
declaración
China for
y
his
le doy la
statement, and
palabra
I
al
give the floor
representante
to
de
the
Francia.
representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie le secrétaire général des Nations
thank the
Unies
United
pour
Nations
son
Secretary General
intervention.
for his statement.
Nous nous réunissons
We
aujourd'hui
have
afin
gathered
d'évoquer
today
les menaces
to
à la paix et à la
address a
sécurité
threat to
internationale
international peace and
soulevées par la
security,
situation en
a
Syrie,
threat that has arisen as a result
6
of the
jours
situation in
après
Syria,
le nouveau
6
carnage
days
chimique
after the latest
survenu
chemical
le 7
weapons
avril
carnage, which
à
took
Douma.
place 7 April in Douma.
Depuis 7 années,
For the past 7
situation en Syrie
years, the situation in
constitue
Syria
assurément
has,
une menace grave
without a
à la
doubt,
paix et à la sécurité
constituted a
internationale
grave threat to
au
international
sens
peace
de
and
la Charte des
security,
Nations Unies.
as
defined in the United Nations Charter. The Security Council itself characterized this as such unanimously on 27 September 2013, when Resolution 2118 was adopted. This in the wake of the heinous chemical weapons attacks which took place in eastern Ghouta. The world at that point discovered, for the first time with horror, discovered the symptoms of large-scale chemical weapons-related death in Syria. Sir, in the light of those seeking to sow confusion, going so far as to accuse the Syrian people themselves of having gassed themselves, in the light of those suggesting conspiracy theories, those endeavoring methodically to destroy our methods of instruments of action on chemical weapons in Syria, in the light of all of this, we must return to simple facts. Yes, the situation, the crisis in Syria constitutes a threat to international peace and security. This threat is related to the repeated, organized, systematic use of chemical weapons by the Bashar al-Assad regime, which once again crossed the threshold of horror with 2 attacks perpetrated in Douma on 7 April last. These attacks, which claimed the lives of several dozen people at least, and wounded hundreds of others, these victims, many of these victims will continue to suffer throughout their lives the respiratory and neurological after-effects, which are very serious. There is no doubt as to the responsibility of Damascus in this attack. Facts were collected on the ground. There are symptoms of the victims, the complexity of the use of the substances, as well as the determination of the regime forces to, as expeditiously as possible, using every means at their disposal to cause the last pockets of Douma of resistance to yield. All point to this, and this has been documented and confirmed. An independent mechanism was created at the initiative of the Security Council. It had already established at least 4 times since 2015 that there was chemical weapons used by the Damascus regime in Sarmin, in Talmenes, in Kmenas, and in Han Sheikhun. An investigative mechanism which a permanent member of the Security Council decided last November to force into silence. Mr. President, the chemical policy of the Bashar al-Assad regime is among the most blatant violations and most serious violations of all the norms which guarantee our collective security. A violation, firstly, of all international obligations vis-à-vis prohibition of chemical weapons under the OPCW, to which Syria is a party. Second, this constitutes a violation of the very foundations of international humanitarian law, namely the principles of distinction, of precaution, and of proportionality. Third, this constitutes a breach of successive Security Council violations 2118, 2209, 2235, and thereby a breach of the obligations incumbent upon Syria under the UN Charter. And lastly, the use of chemical weapons against civilians was banned in 1925 under the Geneva Protocol. This constitutes a war crime under the International Criminal Court statute. The United Nations Secretary General in August 2013 called chemical weapons use a crime against humanity. This chemical weapons war is a tool to accelerate a deliberate policy of submission through terror. This is a policy which, over the course of 7 years, has claimed the lives of 400,000 people, led to the deliberate destruction of civilian and health infrastructure in entire regions, caused a mass exodus of refugees and displaced people, and this has played into the hands of international terrorists. This bleak picture is among the gravest threats to international peace and security of the contemporary era. It is also the result of those and a consequence of the actions of those who continue to support it. taking all means necessary. Once again, I wish to point to something evident. If Syria continues to use toxic substances for military purposes, this means that it has preserved the capacity to use and manufacture them. This is a breach of its international commitments. This is a breach of the guarantees delivered by Russia under the 2013 Russo-American Agreement and a breach of Security Council resolutions. So for a number of years now, the OPCW has informed us as to major persistent doubts vis-à-vis the sincerity of the initial declaration of Syria to the organization in 2013. Many of the questions and the requests set forth by the OPCW have been left without response. Syria has never provided a satisfactory explanation to the fact that inspectors discovered substances and capacities which Syria had previously never declared. These capacities have once again been seen by us in action on 7 April. They were used to kill the greatest possible number of civilians, used to terrorize survivors, and used to entrench the definitive reconquering of Douma by the Syrian regime. Beyond Syria, this impunity has lasted since 2013. It affects the whole of the chemical weapons non-proliferation regime, and with it, the entire security system which collectively we forged since the Second World War. It is this legacy of collective security that has been built to protect succeeding generations from the scourges of violence and after two world wars. This is what members of the Security Council have been mandated to safeguard. Without it is necessary to act to chemical weapons. Otherwise, the genie of non-proliferation will emerge from its bottle. And the consequences of this will be paid by all of us. Mr. President,
le Conseil de sécurité, auquel la Charte des Nations Unies confie la responsabilité principale du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale,
assigned by the United Nations Charter with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security on behalf of the whole of the international community, is more than justified today in convening. It is more than justified once again to observe that there has been a violation of international law, of its own resolutions, and that there are persistent proven threats to international peace and security. It is more than justified to urgently restore a mechanism for attribution of responsibility in chemical weapons attacks. The opportunity was once again provided in vain on Tuesday. The opportunity was provided on Tuesday with the draft resolution proposed by the U.S. It is more than justified to do what has been assigned to it, that is to take measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. In the light of the mass atrocities perpetrated in Syria, action of the Security Council has for a number of years been paralyzed by successive Russian vetoes. 12 times the Russian Federation exercised vetoes on Russia, 6 times on the chemical weapons dossier. The aim of these vetoes was purely to protect the Syrian regime, to guarantee impunity in contempt of the body of international standards, to allow for what cannot be defended. Russia deliberately chose to sacrifice the Security Council's capacity to act, the most significant tool for our collective security. And we saw proof of this once again on last Tuesday, on 7 April, the name Douma has joined those of Ypres, Halabja, Han Che-hoon in the litany of chemical weapons massacres. Mr. President, I wish to state this formally today. Deciding once again to use chemical weapons, in deciding to do this on 7 April, the regime has reached the point of no return. France will shoulder its responsibility to end an intolerable threat to our collective security, to finally ensure respect for international law, respect for the provisions adopted over the course of a number of years by the Security Council. A chemical weapons attack such as what took place in Douma, which was to gas the last residents of a besieged enclave as it was about to fall, as the last fighters are negotiating their surrender. This is the height of cynicism. This is where we stand after 7 years of the regime's waging war against its people. This is a situation to which the world must provide a robust, united, and steadfast
Il sera également
response, and
essentiel
this
de
is our
lutter contre
responsibility. It is
l'impunité
also
de
critical for
ceux
us
qui
to
sont
combat
responsables de
impunity, and this
l'emploi
will
de telles
continue to be
armes,
necessary.
et plus largement de
Impunity
ceux
for
qui sont
those
responsables
responsible for the use
des
of such
crimes les
weapons,
plus
and more
graves
broadly,
commis en Syrie.
those responsible
L'engagement
for
de la
the
France en
most
ce
serious
sens
crime
est
perpetrated
entier.
in Syria. France's
C'est le sens
commitment
du
in this
partenariat
regard is
international
ironclad.
contre
This is the
l'impunité
thrust of the
d'utilisation
International
d'armes chimiques
Partnership Against
que nous
Impunity
avons
of
initié
Chemical
en
Weapons
janvier
Use,
dernier.
partnership which we
Nous
initiated
continuerons
last
également de
January.
soutenir et
We will
d'aider dans
continue to
leurs travaux
support
tous les
and to
mécanismes
assist in their
internationaux
work, to support
chargés
and assist
d'enquêter
all
sur les crimes les
international
plus graves
mechanisms
commis contre les
tasked
populations
with
civiles en Syrie.
investigating the most serious crimes perpetrated against
Au-delà de la question
civilians in
chimique,
Syria.
ce sont les
Beyond the
violations
chemical weapons
permanentes du
issue,
droit international humanitaire qui
the
doivent cesser sans délai.
consistent and persistent
Nous l'avons
violations of
nous-mêmes
international humanitarian
exigé
law must
en
end
adoptant à
without delay.
l'unanimité la résolution
We demanded
2401
this by adopting unanimously
piétinée
Resolution
dès le lendemain de
2401,
son adoption
which was trampled
par
upon
la reprise
immediately
de
after its
bombardement du
adoption
régime avec le soutien
through
actif
the
de ses
resumption
alliés,
of the shelling by the regime with
ceux
active
qui, au
support
sein
of
de
its
ce
allies,
Conseil,
including
avaient
those
souscrit à la
who at the
trêve.
Council, at this Council,
La résolution
embraced
2401 n'a
the
rien
truce.
perdu de son
Resolution
actualité, bien au
2401
contraire.
fully
Un accès
remains
humanitaire
relevant.
entier et sans entrave pour
Comprehensive,
venir en
unfettered
aide aux
humanitarian access
populations
to
en
deliver
détresse
assistance to
doit
people
être
in
mise en
need
œuvre sans délai
must
et sur
be
l'ensemble du
provided
territoire.
without delay
Il est
throughout
indispensable et
the
urgent que
country.
des
It
convois
is
humanitaires puissent parvenir
indispensable,
en
urgent
sécurité dans
for
la Ghouta
humanitarian
orientale
convoys to
et que la
safely reach
protection des
eastern
civils
Ghouta,
fuyant les
for
hostilités
civilians
nécessitant
fleeing
un traitement
hostility to be
médical
provided with
puisse être
protection
assuré.
and for them to receive
Enfin,
the necessary medical
nous ne pourrons
treatment.
résoudre durablement la crise
Lastly,
syrienne
the only way
que
to
dans le cadre
provide a
d'une
lasting
solution
resolution to the Syrian crisis is through a
inclusive
political,
et sur la base de la pleine mise en
inclusive
œuvre de la
solution
résolution
undergirded
2254
by
du
full
Conseil de
implementation
sécurité.
of Security Council Resolution
C'est à ces conditions que
2254.
nous pourrons mettre un terme aux souffrances du peuple syrien,
This is the way we can put an
éradiquer le
end to the
terrorisme
suffering of the
et
Syrian
travailler
people.
ensemble
This is
à la
how we can
stabilité du
eradicate
Moyen-Orient.
terrorism, and this is how
Cette solution
we
politique,
can
nous
restore
l'appelons de nos vœux
stability in the Middle
depuis
East.
7
We have been
années.
calling for this political
Que ceux
solution
qui nous rejoignent
for 7
aujourd'hui pour
years.
s'inquiéter des conséquences de la crise
Those who are
syrienne
alarmed along
contraignent
with us
enfin le régime
at the consequences
à
of the Syrian
accepter une
crisis,
logique de
let them
négociation
finally
sous
compel the
l'égide
regime
des
to
Nations Unies.
embrace an approach of negotiation
Monsieur le
under the
Président, nous ne
aegis of the United
pouvons
Nations.
laisser sans
Mr.
réagir
President, we
les
cannot
valeurs et les normes
leave
les plus fondamentales
without
de notre
response and breach of the
humanité,
most fundamental norms
telles
and values of our
qu'inspirées par la Charte des
humanity,
Nations Unies,
as
bafouées
inscribed
et
in the UN
méprisées
Charter.
au vu
These have
et
been
au su de
mocked and they have been
Ces
trampled
valeurs et
upon
ces normes
in
doivent
the full
être
sight of all.
défendues et
These
protégées.
must be
Telle est
defended.
bien
They
la raison
must be
d'être de
protected.
notre
That
engagement,
is the very
restaurer
reason
l'interdiction
for our
absolue des armes
commitment
chimiques
to
qui est gravée dans le marbre
restore
des
the
conventions
prohibition
internationales
of chemical weapons
et
use, which
consolider
is
ce faisant
engraved in
la
the
règle
marble
de
of
droit.
international law, to
C'est la
uphold the rule of
responsabilité de
law.
ceux qui croient,
This is the
comme la
responsibility
France,
of those who
à un
believe, as
multilatéralisme
France does,
efficace
in effective
incarné par des Nations
multilateralism,
Unies
which is
respectées.
embodied by a
Nous
respected
devons
United
arrêter
Nations.
l'escalade chimique
We must
syrienne.
cease the
Nous ne
chemical
pouvons
weapons
laisser un
escalation
pays
in Syria.
défier
We
à la
must
fois ce Conseil et
not
le
allow
droit
a council to
international.
flout both this
Et
council
cette
and
capacité
international
laissée à
law.
Damas de transgresser
This
toutes nos normes
that
qui
we cannot allow a
constituent une
transgression
menace
by
à la
Damascus
sécurité internationale.
of the norms which
Mettons-y
are
un terme.
under international law. Let us put an end to this.
Le
Thank you.
agradezco al representante de
I thank the
Francia por su
representative of
declaración
France for his
y le doy la
statement, and I
palabra
now
a
give
la
the floor to the
representante del
representative
Reino
of the
Unido.
United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, and thank you to the Secretary-General. Secretary-General, you gave us a catalogue of danger in the Middle East, including Gaza, Yemen and Iraq. It is no disrespect to those issues that today, like other speakers, I will concentrate on Syria. The United Kingdom will be ready to put its shoulder to the wheel on those other issues when the time comes. Mr. President, the situation we face today and the reason we are in this Council today arise wholly and solely from the use of chemical weapons on the Syrian people, most probably by the Syrian regime. Not just once, Mr. President, but consistently, persistently over the past 5 years. The highest degree of responsibility, to quote the Russian ambassador, is indeed what this Council, and in particular the P5, are for, that is our duty to uphold. Mr. President, the British Cabinet met recently and they concluded that the Assad regime has a track record of the use of chemical weapons and that it is highly likely the regime is responsible for Saturday's attack. This is a further example of the erosion of international law in relation to the use of chemical weapons, as my French and American colleagues have set out. And it is deeply concerning, but more importantly than that, Mr. President, the use of chemical weapons cannot be allowed to go unchallenged. The British Cabinet has agreed on the need to take action to alleviate humanitarian distress and to deter the further use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, and we will continue to work with our friends and allies to coordinate an international response to that end. Mr. President, the Secretary-General mentioned the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, was bracketed by East-West cooperation. We have been on the same side as Russia. In April 1945, Russia liberated Vienna as part of our joint efforts to bring peace to Europe. In 1995, they passed the Dayton Accords as part of our joint efforts to bring peace and stability to Bosnia. But in 2018, they refused to work with us to bring peace to Syria. Instead, Mr. President, since the first attack on Ghouta and CWUs in 2013, the Joint Investigative Mechanism has ascribed 2 uses of mustard gas to Daesh, 3 uses of chlorine to the Syrian regime, and 1 use of sarin to the Syrian regime before the latest attack. As my French colleague has set out, UK, US and France are members in good standing of the Chemical Weapons Convention. We are members and supporters of the OPCW and its fact-finding mission. We would have dispatched an investigative mission in the debates in this Council earlier this week, but only Russia and Bolivia blocked that. Mr. President, Syria is the latest in a pernicious chronology of disregard for international law and disrespect for the international institutions that we have built together to keep us collectively safe by Russia. This is revealed, Mr. President, in actions over Georgia 10 years ago, over MH17, over the attack in Salisbury, which we will return to next week. Let me repeat what I said in this Council last week. My government, the British people, are not Russophobe. We have no quarrel with the Russian people. We respect Russia as a country. We prefer a productive relationship with Russia. But it is Russia's own actions that have led to this situation. Mr. President, what has taken place in Syria to date is in itself a violation of the UN Charter. No principle or purpose of the Charter is upheld or served by the use of CW on innocent civilians. On the contrary, to stand by, to ignore the requirements of justice, accountability, and the preservation of the non-proliferation regime is to place all our security, not just that of the Syrian people, at the mercy of a Russian veto. We will not sacrifice the international order we have collectively built to the Russian desire to protect its ally at all costs. Mr. President, the Russian ambassador set out what Russia is doing on the ground in Syria. He thought this might be inconvenient for me to hear. Mr. President, it's not inconvenient for me to point out that Russia has given $5.5 million to the UN appeal. The United Kingdom has given $160 million, Mr. President, and this is part of a contribution totaling $3.5 billion in all. It's not inconvenient to me to say that. It may be inconvenient for the Russian ambassador to hear it. The Russian ambassador also asked why we were not joining in trying to stabilise actions in Syria and bring about peace. We have tried, Mr. President. We have tried very hard to support Stefan de Mistura in getting the Geneva political process underway, and we shall continue to do so. But we do not join Russia, sadly, because Russia's efforts have not been to try and restart the Geneva process. Instead, they have been to support Syria in the use of CW and the bombardment of the Syrian people. In the area known as T4, they helped the regime liberate this area, but they took their eye off the ball and Daesh took it back. They took it again, but sadly, foreign fighters have been able to re-establish themselves there. This is not de-escalation. This is not political progress. This is a gross distortion by Russia of what is actually happening on the ground. Mr. President, these are truly exceptional circumstances that we face today. My US and French colleagues have set out in great detail the catalogue of awful things that are happening to the Syrian people. This catalogue goes to the heart of what the Geneva Conventions, the Non-Proliferation Regime, the United Nations and this Council are for. It is not only dangerous what Russia is doing, Mr. President, in vetoing our resolutions and in supporting the Syrian regime's actions against its own people, it is ultimately prejudicial to our security. It will let Daesh re-establish itself. It is something, Mr. President, that we believe we need to take action to defend. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante del Reino Unido por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Suecia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you very much, Secretary General, for your briefing today, for your efforts and for your good offices. Mr. President, last weekend, reports once again began to emerge of horrifying allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, this time in Douma, with reports of a large number of civilian casualties. Like many others, we were alarmed by these extremely serious allegations, and we called for an immediate, impartial and thorough investigation to establish the facts. In that regard, we welcome the fact that the OPCW's fact-finding mission has been deployed to Syria. Full access and cooperation by all parties must now be ensured. Mr. President, I want to reiterate here again that we will spare no effort to combat the use and proliferation of chemical weapons by state or non-state actors anywhere in the world. We unequivocally condemn in the strongest terms the use of chemical weapons, including in Syria. It's a serious violation of international law. It constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and their use in armed conflict is a war crime. The international disarmament and non-proliferation regime must be safeguarded. This is best achieved through true multilateralism and broad international consensus. Mr. President, we share the outrage and frustration of many in this chamber about chemical weapons use in Syria. Those responsible for such crimes must be held accountable. We cannot accept impunity. The conflict in Syria is in its 8th year, and we are at a dangerous moment. We fully share the deep concern expressed by the Secretary General about the risks of the current impasse, the need to avoid the situation to escalate and spiral out of control, and to pay further attention to the divides, tensions, and fault lines in the region, as described again by the Secretary General this morning. Mr. President, we remain deeply disappointed that the Council was unable to agree and move forward on a substantial, swift, and unified response to the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We deeply regret that Russia once again used its veto and blocked the Council from taking action this week. Over the last number of days, we have tried to ensure that all peaceful means to respond seriously be considered. We are working tirelessly to ensure that no stone is left unturned in efforts to find a way forward in this Council. The Secretary General offered to support such efforts through his good offices. This is an opportunity that should be seized. That is why we yesterday circulated yet another proposal that asked for 4 things. Firstly, it condemns in the strongest terms any use of chemical weapons in Syria, and it expresses alarm at the alleged incident in Douma last weekend, because the use of chemical weapons constitutes a serious violation of international law. Secondly, it demands full access and cooperation for the OPCW fact-finding mission, because we need facts and evidence about what happened in Douma last weekend. Thirdly, it expresses the Council's determination to establish a new, impartial, objective and independent attribution mechanism based on a proposal by the Secretary General, because the perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks must be identified and held to account, and to that end we need a new mechanism. Fourthly, it requests the Secretary General to dispatch immediately a high-level disarmament mission to Syria, because we need to resolve all outstanding issues on chemical weapons and rid Syria once and for all of all of all possible chemical weapons that might still exist in the country. Such a mission would add political and diplomatic leverage to the necessary technical and professional work of the OPCW. So we call on members of this Council to muster the political will and to adhere to the appeal by the Secretary General in order to come together and move forward. Mr. President, the use of chemical weapons is a serious threat to international peace and security. It is indeed deplorable that this Council has not yet been able to come together and agree on a timely and firm response. Even though the use of chemical weapons in itself violates international law, and a response must comply with international law and respect the UN Charter. The time has now come to urgently revert to a political process under UN auspices for a political solution in line with Resolution 2254. And for Syria and the Astana guarantors to move forward with no further delay and live up to their commitments. For Resolution 2401, demanding a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian access to be fully and urgently implemented. This is the only way to end the suffering of the Syrian people and to put an end to this brutal 7-year-long conflict. Mr. President, we strongly believe there is a way for the Council to shoulder its responsibilities in accordance with the Charter. We believe there is still a way for the Council to come together and that we need to ensure that we have exhausted every peaceful effort and diplomatic option to stop further atrocities carried out in Syria, to hold those responsible to account, to come to terms once and for all with this chemical weapons issue in Syria, to cease hostilities and find a political solution. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de
I thank
Suecia
the
por su
representative of
declaración
Sweden for his
y le doy la
statement, and then
palabra
I'll
al
give the floor to the
representante de Guinea
representative of
Ecuatorial.
Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President.
Señor presidente,
President,
en primer lugar,
as my
y en
first
nombre de
order
la
of
República de
business,
Guinea
and on behalf
Ecuatorial,
of the Republic of
quiero
Equatorial
agradecer
Guinea,
al señor
I would
secretario
like to
general
thank the
Antonio
Secretary
Guterres
General, Mr. Antonio
por
Guterres,
habernos ilustrado
for
sobre la
having
caótica y
provided us
peligrosa
with a very
situación
detailed
que
panorama
impera
of the chaotic and
actualmente
dangerous
en Oriente
situation
Medio,
which currently prevails in the
haciendo un
Middle East.
recorrido pormenorizado
He
de
gave
cada
us
uno de
an
los
overview
conflictos
in a very
en
meticulous
esta
way of
vulnerable
each of the
región
conflicts
e
in this very
incluso en
vulnerable and
Libia,
fragile region,
hasta
including
desembocar
in
en la
Libya.
desoladora y devastadora
And he
crisis
also
siria,
referred to,
que a
of course,
todas
to the
luces
devastating and
corre
painful
el
crisis in
inminente
Syria,
riesgo de una
a
seria
situation which
degradación.
runs the risk of deteriorating seriously
Señor
and
presidente,
yet further still.
En línea con la
President,
declaración del secretario general,
in line with the statement by
confirmamos
the
aquí
Secretary
la
General,
posición de
we
la
would
República
like
de Guinea
to once
Ecuatorial
again state
frente
the
a estas
position of
situaciones
Equatorial Guinea when it comes
siempre
to
es
situations
la del
of this
diálogo,
ilk.
la convicción de que
Position,
hay
our
que
stance
crear
is always
y respetar los
pro-dialogue, backed by
mecanismos de
conviction that we have
resolución
to establish
pacífica
and
de
respect the
controversias
mechanisms for the peaceful
y hay
settlement
que
of
recurrir a
disputes,
ellas
and we have to make
hasta
sure we
la
exhaust
saciedad.
every possible avenue said mechanisms
La
offer
respuesta
us.
militar unilateral puede llegar a ser
unilateral military
contraproducente,
response could
lejos de
very easily
resolver el
backfire,
problema,
far from resolving the
contribuiría a
problem.
crear más
It could heap
sufrimiento,
suffering
más
upon
caos
suffering
del
and
que ya
unleash
existe,
greater chaos
como lo ha indicado el secretario general.
than that
Más
already
desorden,
exists. And that which
véase el
the
caso de
Secretary
Libia,
General
que
already
conocemos bien en África,
depicted. It could also unleash
cuyas
greater
consecuencias
disorder. The example of Libya, with
abarcan
its
hoy
litany of
toda la
wars
región
which in Africa are all too
sahelo-saheliana
familiar,
y
will
parte de
suffice
África
to prove
Central.
my point. As in
Estamos
Central Africa,
totalmente
the
en
Sahel-Saharan
contra del
region of
uso de la
Africa, we are
fuerza.
suffering the fallout
Este es solo
of
si es legítimo
Libya's
bajo
current
las
plight.
condiciones
We
que
are implacably
establece la
opposed
Carta
to
de
the
las
use of
Naciones
force. Use of
Unidas
force is only
y además
legitimate
cuando
under
se
the
emplea
conditions
como
established
último
in the Charter
recurso,
of the United Nations,
habiendo
and in
agotado
addition,
todas las
it can
demás
only be used as a last resort,
vías.
having exhausted
Señor
all other
presidente,
options. President,
nos preocupa
we
la
are
retórica que se
concerned
está
by the
adoptando.
inflammatory war of words that
Nos
is broken
suena
out.
peligrosamente familiar
It leaves
y no
us
nos
with
gusta
an
dónde
all
nos
too
puede llevar.
dangerous sense of déjà vu, and we are
Apelamos
wary
al
of
sentido de la
where this rhetoric
responsabilidad de
could
las
take us.
potencias,
We appeal
especialmente a
to
los
the
miembros
sense of
permanentes del
responsibility
Consejo,
of the major powers, in
puesto que
particular the permanent
entendemos que
members of this
tienen
council,
una
given
responsabilidad
that we
añadida de
charge that they
defender la
have an added
relevancia
responsibility
del Consejo
of
de
upholding the
Seguridad.
relevance of the Security Council.
Queremos poner unas
We would like to
preguntas
put
sobre la
three-
mesa.
we would like to put three questions on the table
¿A
for
quién
reflection.
beneficia la incapacidad del
Who
Consejo
will
de Seguridad de
benefit from
tomar
the Security
decisiones?
Council's current inability to take decisions?
¿Estamos contribuyendo
Are we
a deslegitimar el
contributing
Consejo?
to delegitimizing the Council?
¿Estamos activamente
Are we in
erosionando
fact
la relevancia
actively
del Consejo en el
eroding
panorama
the
político
relevance of the
internacional?
Security Council on the current international
Si
political
el Consejo
stage?
no puede tomar acciones, no puede
If the
emprender,
Council is
¿cuánto
paralyzed
tiempo va a
and is
pasar
unable
antes de
to
que la
act,
comunidad
how
internacional
long
retire su
will
fe,
it take before the
esperanza,
international
su confianza
community
en este
regains its
Consejo?
faith, its hope and its trust in this Security
Señor
Council?
Presidente, No hay solución militar al problema
There can be
sirio,
no
por lo
military
tanto
solution to
debemos
the
seguir
Syrian
buscando
problem,
formas
and
de
thus we must
resolver
continue
el
to seek out
conflicto
ways
por
of
vía
resolving the
diplomática.
issue through diplomatic channels.
Todos los miembros del Consejo
All
debemos
the members
actuar
of the
con
Security
responsabilidad
Council must act
y
with a sense of
ponernos de acuerdo en
responsibility
crear
and
un
reach
mecanismo
agreement on establishing an
independiente e imparcial
independent and
de
impartial
verificación de
mechanism
los hechos
to
ocurridos
verify
en
the
Duma
facts of the
y
event that occurred
establecer
in
las
Duma and to
responsabilidades
attribute
y asegurarse de
responsibility
que
and
los
to ensure that the
autores afronten la
perpetrators
acción de la
are properly
justicia.
prosecuted.
Señor Presidente,
President,
el secretario general
the
ha
Secretary
declarado
General
estar decepcionado
has
por la
stated
incapacidad de
that
este
he is
Consejo de
disappointed
Seguridad
by the inability of the
de poder
Security
crear un
Council
mecanismo
to
que investigue,
establish a
identifique
mechanism
y atribuya
that would
responsabilidad a los
investigate
utilizadores
and
de armas
attribute
químicas.
responsibility for the use
No
of chemical
podemos sino
weapons.
estar muy de acuerdo
We can
con
only
esta
state that we
declaración,
fully agree with
ya
the
que hace
Secretary
unos
General's
días
statement, particularly
nuestra,
given that a few
nuestra
days
delegación
ago,
declaró estar
my
frustrada
delegation expressed its
cuando el Consejo
frustration
fue incapaz
when the
de
Security
adoptar
Council, a
una de
scant
las
few days
tres
ago, proved
resoluciones
itself
puestas
unable
a
to adopt
votación.
any of the three resolutions
Señor
put to a
Presidente,
vote on the same
la
issue, creating an
oferta del
attributive
señor
mechanism.
secretario general de las Naciones
President,
Unidas
the
sobre
Secretary
sus buenos
General's generous
oficios
office to use
debe
his
ser
good
tenida
offices
en cuenta
must be seized upon and borne
debemos
in mind, and he
proporcionarle
must be
esa
given room
oportunidad.
to pursue this option fully.
Concluimos esta intervención, señor Presidente, reiterando la posición del Gobierno de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial en abogar en contra y condenar la utilización de armas químicas y de otras armas de destrucción masiva, sea quien sea que las utilice. Muchas gracias.
Le agradezco al representante de Guinea Ecuatorial por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante del Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Quiero agradecerle por haber organizado esta reunión, saludar la presencia de nuestro secretario general entre nosotros. Sus diagnósticos son siempre muy precisos y útiles. Le agradecemos por el intenso trabajo que desarrolla en beneficio de los principios y propósitos de nuestra organización. Señor presidente, por alguna razón, algunos miembros de nuestro Consejo evitan hablar del motivo principal de la convocatoria de esta reunión, que es que uno de los Estados miembros ha amenazado con el uso unilateral del uso de la fuerza en violación a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Se ha hablado sobre el uso de armas químicas y Bolivia desea dejar claramente establecida su condena total y absoluta al uso de armas químicas o el uso de elementos químicos como armas, por ser este un hecho injustificable y criminal donde quiera, cuando y por quien quiera que sea cometido, puesto que su uso es un delito grave contra el derecho internacional y la paz y seguridad internacional. Los responsables de la comisión de estos terribles y criminales actos deben ser identificados, investigados, procesados y sancionados. Exigimos una investigación transparente e imparcial para que debe determinar a los responsables de cualquier acto de uso de armas químicas. Es imprescindible que el Consejo de Seguridad, por supuesto, garantice una investigación independiente, imparcial, completa y concluyente y fundamentalmente, además, despolitizada. Lamentamos que el Consejo de Seguridad hasta ahora no haya alcanzado ese objetivo. Sin embargo, nos sumaremos a cualquier esfuerzo que esté destinado a lograrlo. Por supuesto que uno de los motivos es imprescindible hablar, y estoy seguro que el Consejo continuará hablando del tema del uso de armas químicas. Pero lo que nos trae a esta reunión es, reitero, las amenazas de un Estado miembro con el uso ilegal de la fuerza. La humanidad ha construido en estos últimos 72 años una estructura, decíamos, no solamente física, no solamente institucional, sino además jurídica. Ha construido instrumentos de derecho internacional para evitar justamente que los más poderosos ataquen con impunidad a los más débiles, para garantizar un equilibrio en el mundo y evitar naturalmente que haya gravísimas violaciones a la paz y a la seguridad internacional. Hemos construido, y prueba clara de ello es este Consejo, un sistema internacional basado en reglas. Es deber del Consejo y de todos los órganos de las Naciones Unidas respetar esas
to respect
defender
said
el
rules, to
multilateralismo.
defend and uphold
La Carta de las Naciones
multilateralism.
Unidas
The Charter of the
debe
United
ser respetada
Nations must
y
be
la Carta de las
respected,
Naciones Unidas
and the
prohíbe
Charter of
las
the United
acciones
Nations
unilaterales.
prohibits unilateral military action.
Otro detalle muy importante
Another key
es que el
detail
Consejo de Seguridad no
is
son
that the
solo los
Security
5 miembros
Council
permanentes.
is not just composed of the 5 permanent
El
members.
Consejo de Seguridad
The
no
Security
son solo los
Council
15 miembros
is
que
not
están
just
alrededor
the
de esta
15
mesa.
members sat around this table
El
either.
Consejo de
The
Seguridad
Security
representa
Council
a toda la
represents the
membresía, a los
entire membership of
193
this family. It
estados
represents all
y esos estados a
193
sus
member
pueblos.
states of the United Nations and their peoples.
El Consejo de Seguridad no
The
debe ser
Security
usado como una
Council
caja de
must not
resonancia
be
de la propaganda
used
de guerra ni del
for the
intervencionismo.
propaganda of war. It must not be used
Tampoco
for the
debe ser
rhetoric of
utilizado como un
interventionalism,
peón
nor
a
must it be
sacrificar
used
en un
as a
tablero de
pawn
ajedrez,
that can be
en el tablero de
sacrificed
ajedrez
on
de
the
la guerra,
chessboard
de la
of
geopolítica,
the
de los intereses
geopolitical
mezquinos.
strategies and interests, and petty interests at that, of others.
Hemos escuchado muchos antecedentes
We have
históricos
heard
acerca
many stories and many
del
histories
régimen de prohibición del uso
about
de
the
armas químicas.
regime we set
Bolivia
up
es
to
una
prohibit the use of
parte
chemical
activa
weapons, and Bolivia is an
de ese
active
sistema. Pero me
participant in
gustaría
said chemical
hablar de algunos de
non-proliferation
los
regime and system, but I would like to
antecedentes de
talk
nuestra
about
Carta
part
de
of the
las Naciones
background
Unidas.
of the Charter of the United Nations, to flesh out what's been said
Cuando
about the
uno
background of non-proliferation
tiene
of chemical
dudas
weapons.
acerca de cómo
When someone
actuar
has doubts about how we should
en
act or
determinadas
proceed in a
circunstancias,
given situation or set of
leía
circumstances,
que la mejor
then
forma de resolver
I
esa
have
duda
heard it said that
es
the best way to
identificar
resolve that doubt
dónde
is
están
to
los
identify
principios que han nacido en la
where
Revolución
the
Francesa,
principles of
dónde
the French
se
Revolution
defienden los principios de
apply.
libertad, igualdad y
Where are the
fraternidad.
principles of liberty, equality,
Ese
and
es uno de los
fraternity
orígenes de
being
la Carta
upheld in
de
your
las
action?
Naciones
And
Unidas.
this is the inspiration of the
Otro de los
Charter of the
orígenes de
United
la Carta de las
Nations. How do we
Naciones
uphold
Unidas, de
those
los
French revolutionary
antecedentes de la Carta de las
principles?
Naciones
One
Unidas
of the sources of
es, por supuesto,
inspiration
la
of
Carta
the
Magna,
Charter of the United Nations is
que
the
por
Magna
primera vez en
Carta
la
as
historia
well, which for the
limita el
first time in
ejercicio del
history
poder
put limits and
justamente para
bounds
defender a los
on
más
the use of
débiles.
power to protect the weakest. That was the whole purpose of the Magna Carta.
Otro de los antecedentes de la Carta
One of the inspirations of the
de las
Charter of the
Naciones
United
Unidas
Nations,
es
in
la
addition to the
Conferencia
French
de Yalta.
Revolution and
Leía
the
que en la
Magna Carta,
Conferencia
is
de
the Yalta
Yalta
Conference. And
se
I have read that the
estableció
Yalta
este
Conference
sistema de
established
control
the
y de
system of checks and
contrapesos, que es el Consejo de
balances of
Seguridad con sus
control,
5 miembros
the pinnacle of
permanentes.
which is supposed to be the Security
Bolivia no
Council
estuvo
with
en
its
la
5
Conferencia de
permanent
Yalta.
members. Now, Bolivia was not a participant
Entiendo
in the
que
Yalta
solamente
Conference.
Churchill,
I've heard that only
Roosevelt,
Churchill,
Stalin
Roosevelt,
estuvieron
and
en
Stalin were
la
in fact at the
Conferencia de
Yalta
Yalta,
Conference.
que luego fue ratificada en la
The
Conferencia
Yalta
de San
Conference
Francisco
was
pocos
later
meses después,
ratified
en
in the San Francisco
1945.
Conference, which took place
Ese
a
es el
few months
sistema
later in
que hemos acordado
1945. This is the
respetar.
system, the history of the system that we all agree to respect and to
Por eso que creo que
uphold.
es imprescindible
And it's for
leer
that
lo que
reason that we
dicen
believe
los
that it is
principios
vital at all times when in doubt
nuestra
to look
carta.
back to the principles of our charter
El
as well as
artículo
its
2
source
dice
of
lo siguiente,
inspiration.
y esto no es papel mojado, esto no es
And
solamente
this is not
para
just
distribuir a los
fine
turistas que
words.
vienen
This is
a
not
la
just
sede de
something
las
that we
Naciones
distribute to
Unidas.
tourists who visit the
Esta es la
United
norma que
Nations.
hemos
These are
acordado
the norms, the
cumplir y hacer
regulations, and the
cumplir.
standards which we have agreed to
Y dice el
uphold and to
artículo 2,
ensure that are upheld.
para la
Article 2 states,
realización de los propósitos consignados en el artículo 1, la
in
organización y
pursuit of
sus
purposes
miembros
stated in
procederán de
Article 1, the
acuerdo con los
organization and
siguientes
its members shall act in
principios. Y el
accordance with the
número 4
following
dice lo
principles. And
siguiente,
number 4 of those principles
los
sets the
miembros de
following.
la
All
organización
members
en sus
shall
relaciones
refrain in their
internacionales
international
se
relations
abstendrán de recurrir
from
a la
the
amenaza o al uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial o la independencia política de cualquier Estado o en cualquier otra forma
or in any
incompatible
other
con los
manner
propósitos de
inconsistent
las
with the
Naciones
purposes
Unidas.
of the United Nations. Again, paragraph 4 of Article 2.
Es decir, toda acción
In other words,
de uso de la fuerza
any
debe ser autorizada
use
por
of
el
force
Consejo de
must
Seguridad
be
de acuerdo con la
authorized
Carta
by
de
the
las
Security
Naciones Unidas.
Council, commensurate with the
Por
Charter of the
ende,
United
toda acción
Nations.
unilateral
At the end of the day, any unilateral
es
action
contraria al derecho internacional,
runs
así como a los
counter
valores y
to
principios de la Carta
international
de
law
las
as well as
Naciones
to the
Unidas.
purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. It flouts same.
Y el otro detalle es que
Another detail I wish to bring to your
hemos
attention
escuchado con mucho respeto a
is
nuestros
that
colegas
I
hablar
listened with a
sobre
great deal of respect to
el
colleagues
respeto sobre
talk
el
about
criminal uso de armas
the
químicas.
criminal use of chemical
Coincidimos
weapons,
plenamente
and
con
we
ellos en
fully
eso.
agree with them in that point
Pero
made.
sería absolutamente
But it
peligroso
would be extremely risky,
que
indeed
para combatir la
dangerous,
supuesta
if, in
violación
order
del derecho internacional, se viola el derecho internacional y se viola la propia Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Es por eso
En este caso específico, esperamos que haya una investigación independiente, imparcial, completa y concluyente. Y una aclaración a mi querida colega del Reino Unido. Bolivia votó en contra de una resolución, votó a favor de dos. Y votó en contra porque lamentablemente se utiliza este espacio con fines políticos. Se presentan resoluciones solamente para las cámaras de televisión. Se presentan resoluciones a sabiendas de que van a ser vetadas y no se extreman todos los esfuerzos hasta alcanzar un consenso, como lo hacemos en la mayoría de las resoluciones. Pursue consensus, as is usually our course of action and practice when it comes to resolutions before they come to the chamber itself.
Creemos que esta reunión es muy importante porque no solamente estamos hablando de un ataque contra un Estado miembro, de la amenaza de un ataque militar contra un Estado miembro de las Naciones Unidas, sea cual fuere, sino que estamos viviendo una época de constantes ataques al multilateralismo. Veamos cómo se debilita, por ejemplo, lo alcanzado en el Acuerdo de París sobre el cambio climático. Veamos cómo se debilitan las negociaciones sobre el Pacto Global de Migración. Veamos cómo existe una lógica, una política clara de debilitamiento del multilateralismo. Que lo que pasa es que para algunos se utilizan los derechos humanos, se utiliza el discurso de los derechos humanos, pero cuando ya no les alcanza el discurso de los derechos humanos para satisfacer sus intereses, violan los derechos humanos. Y mi región es testigo de ello. Nosotros hemos sufrido lo que se ha llamado la Operación Cóndor durante los años 70, organizada por los servicios de inteligencia de algunos Estados miembros. Cuando la democracia no les alcanzaba, financiaban golpes de Estado. Cuando los derechos humanos, cuando el discurso de los derechos humanos no les alcanza, violan los derechos humanos. Cuando el discurso de la democracia ya no es suficiente, están dispuestos a financiar golpes de Estado. Y el uso de las prácticas unilaterales deja heridas que aún están abiertas pese al paso de los años. Algunos miembros del Consejo han hablado de la situación de Irak y de Libia. Considero son los peores crímenes que se han cometido en este siglo. La invasión a Libia, con sus tremendas consecuencias, más de 1 millón de muertos. Las acciones contra Libia, las políticas de cambio de régimen, que como muy bien decía mi colega de Guinea Ecuatorial, todavía se sienten y se sufren y se padecen en toda la parte del Sahel y África Central. Pero nadie quiere hablar de las causas profundas de esos conflictos. Y nadie va a hablar de la impunidad de esos gravísimos crímenes. Reitero, los crímenes más graves cometidos durante este siglo. Nosotros esperamos que todos los miembros del Consejo de Seguridad, por la alta responsabilidad que tienen, 10 de nosotros electos por la membresía y 5 con el privilegio de estar permanentemente en este Consejo y con derecho a veto. Nosotros tenemos que dar el ejemplo al resto de la membresía del cumplimiento de los principios y propósitos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Me permito cerrar esta intervención, señor presidente, reiterando una frase del secretario general Ban Ki-moon en una situación similar el año 2013, quien decía lo siguiente, y abro comillas: el Consejo de Seguridad tiene la responsabilidad primordial de la paz y la seguridad internacional. Este es mi llamamiento, que todo debe tratarse en el marco de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. El uso de la fuerza es lícito únicamente en el ejercicio de legítima defensa, de conformidad con el artículo 51 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, o cuando el Consejo de Seguridad apruebe esa acción. Ese fue el propósito de esta reunión, y la posición de Bolivia es de absoluta condena a cualquier amenaza o uso de la fuerza unilateral. Muchas gracias.
Le agradezco al representante de Bolivia por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Kuwait.
في البداية نتقدم بجزيل الشكر للأمين العام على إحاطته القيمة في بداية أعمال هذه الجلسة، ونشاطره القلق من ما تمر به منطقة الشرق الأوسط من أزمات وتحديات، وهي بالفعل مخاطر على السلم والأمن الدوليين، وستتفاقم بدون شك إذا تم تجاهل تنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن قبل الأطراف المعنية. وتأتي القضية الفلسطينية وممارسات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في الأراضي المحتلة وانتهاكاته المستمرة للقانون الإنساني الدولي والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان وقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة كمثال صريح على ذلك. وآخر هذه الانتهاكات هي قمع المظاهرات السلمية في غزة واستخدام القوة المفرطة والتي أسفرت عن مقتل العشرات من المدنيين وإصابة المئات أثناء ممارستهم حقهم المشروع في التظاهر السلمي لإحياء مسيرة العودة الكبرى. تدين الكويت وبأشد العبارات هذه الممارسات الإسرائيلية، ونأسف لعدم تمكن المجلس من اتخاذ موقفا يرفض فيه أعمال القمع ويدعو سلطة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للكف عن الاستمرار. سلطة الاحتلال الإسرائيلية يجب أن لا تكون استثناء، فالجميع عليه أن يحترم ويلتزم بالقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وتنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة، وبما يؤدي إلى التوصل إلى سلام عادل وشامل ودائم يمنح الشعب الفلسطيني حقوقه السياسية المشروعة في إقامة دولة مستقلة على أرضه وعاصمتها القدس. السيد الرئيس، عقدنا اجتماعات عديدة في الأيام القليلة الماضية، ولم نكن لنجتمع هنا اليوم في حال اتفقنا على آلية جديدة للتحقيق في ادعاءات استخدام الأسلحة الكيماوية في سوريا. وهذه الخلافات فيما بين الدول الأعضاء في المجلس عمقت من الانقسام، ولا بد لنا من تكثيف الجهود إزاء كيفية الدفع بالعملية السياسية في سوريا التي أصبحت تراوح مكانها. فمنذ بداية العام انشغلنا بتصعيد أعمال العنف من قبل كافة الأطراف
on the escalation by all parties. We tried to improve the humanitarian situation through the adoption of Resolution 2401, which mainly calls for ending the fighting in all areas of Syria for 30 days at the least. However, this resolution unfortunately remains without implementation. It has been violated in a flagrant violation of the will of the international community. We share the SG's his concern and disappointment vis-à-vis the deterioration in Syria and the continued allegations of the use of chemical weapons. We support his call for an agreement on a new mechanism to guarantee accountability and ending impunity in Syria. We reiterate our support for the fact-finding mission of the OPCW,
التي ستقوم بالتحقق بالادعاءات المتعلقة باستخدام الأسلحة في دوما بالخطوط الشرقية. ونشدد على ضرورة محاسبة مرتكبي هذه الجرائم التي تم تأكيدها. وينبغي علينا كأعضاء في المجلس ومن منطلق مسؤولياتنا أن لا ندخر جهدا ولا نيأس، وأن نواصل محاولاتنا في سبيل التوصل إلى اتفاق يضمن إيجاد آلية مستقلة وحيادية ومهنية لتحديد المسؤولين عن تلك الجرائم ومحاسبتها. أن الانتهاكات المستمرة للقانون الإنساني الدولي وللقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان ولقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة بما في ذلك القرار 2018 وذلك من قبل الأطراف المتنازعة في سوريا تعزز من قناعتنا بضرورة الامتناع عن استخدام حق النقد الفيتو في حال وجود انتهاكات جسيمة لحقوق الإنسان، والتعامل مع أي جرائم ترقى إلى مستوى جرائم ضد الإنسانية وجرائم حرب والمسائل الإنسانية الأخرى كمسائل إجرائية، أي لا يسري عليها حق النقد حتى لا نسمح بتكرار هذه المآسي والمعاناة الكبيرة للمدنيين الأبرياء. إن موقف دولة الكويت مبدئي وثابت من الأزمة السورية، position that we have not changed, and it is in line with the position of the League of Arab States that calls for protecting the unity, the independence, and territorial integrity of Syria and ending the fighting, to end the bloodletting and to protect the Syrians and to reach a peaceful agreement under the auspices of the UN in accordance with the Geneva I Communique of 2012 and Resolution
وبما يحقق انتقالا سياسيا تتوافق عليه جميع مكونات الشعب السوري ويحقق طموحاته المشروعة. وشكرا
سيدي.
Le agradezco al representante de Kuwait por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Kazajstán.
Mr. President, we join others in expressing appreciation to Secretary General for his insightful statement and personal attendance at today's meeting. Since his election as the steward of this world organization, he was ceaselessly promoted, in our opinion, a very important approach, namely the use of amicable and preventive diplomacy. After the alert to the world, the Security Council underlined in its first PRST of 2018 on preventive diplomacy and sustaining peace, adopted during Kazakhstan presidency in the Council, that addressing conflicts may include measures to rebuild trust by bringing together member states around common goals. This has been so especially important in situations when international relations have headed confrontations and tension, behind which the contours of a global war are increasingly apparent. Right now is the very moment when we must exercise special caution and vigilance in making decisions about our actions, especially in the Middle East. We believe it is time to tap into all the tools available for a comprehensive strategy of preventive diplomacy in order to escape the very serious consequences of any military action that can have repercussions for global security and stability. Due to the recent escalation of rhetoric on Syria and the threat of the use of unilateral actions, the delegation of Kazakhstan is deeply alarmed by the unfolding situation, which can endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. We all bear responsibility for compliance with the international law and order. None of our countries have the right to violate the UN Charter and act or threat to act unilaterally with respect to a sovereign nation under any pretext, unless it is decided by the Security Council. The Security Council is a collective body and is designed to take a balanced decision with regards to the issues of peace and security. We can agree or disagree, but we are mandated to work together to achieve a decision. We have to bear a collective responsibility for it. Kazakhstan believes that the most effective way to prevent conflicts is to use diplomacy and mediation, but not military means. We look forward to the next round of talks to be held in Geneva and in our capital, Astana, when the parties will be addressing, among other issues, the stepping up of efforts to ensure observance of their respective agreements. In addressing the disputes over the issue of the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria in Duma, which provoked the latest tension in international relations, we consider it necessary to state the following. Kazakhstan strongly condemns any use of chemical weapons, if confirmed. Impunity is not permissible. We should resolutely act to stop any further use of these inhuman weapons. But we should act on the basis of proven facts. In this particular case, when there are doubts on actual use of poisonous substance, Kazakhstan calls on the members of the Security Council to be patient, at least until the fact-finding mission of the OPCW expert group to Syria is deployed to the site of the alleged chemical weapons attack and reports on the findings of its investigation, especially when yesterday we learned that the Syrian government had granted visas for OPCW investigators and pledged to facilitate access to the sites of alleged chemical attack. We first need to establish and understand the scientific and professional ascertained facts, after which the Council should decide on the appropriate line of actions to be taken. At this stage, any military action or threat of it without the prior approval of the Security Council is undesirable and could have long-lasting negative impact, which would be the most difficult way to overcome and would result in unprecedented and unanticipated complications. Kazakhstan remains committed to the UN Charter and all UN Security Council resolutions aimed at solving political and humanitarian aspects of the Syrian conflict. We believe it is most important to exercise restraint and refrain from any calls and rhetoric that might deteriorate the already fragile and volatile situation. Such pause for reflection on the consequences is necessary for preserving international peace and security. In light of the prevailing circumstances, we need for implementing the recent Resolution 2401 by all Council members, which is most critical, particularly under the present conditions. Crisis in Syria can only be solved through an inclusive and Syrian-led political process based on the Geneva Communiqué of 13th of June 2012, the subsequent Security Council resolutions and relevant statements of the International Syria Support Group. Lastly, we fully endorse views articulated by the Secretary General on 11th of April about the risks of the current impasse we are witnessing today. We must at all costs avoid the situation spiraling out of control. Our ultimate goal should be to end the horrific suffering of the Syrian people and help them to go on the path of peace and progress. We repeat again, it is an urgent time and need to work together to restore unity in the Security Council and achieve its efficiency through rebuilding trust and consensus to preserve global peace and security. We need cooperation within the Security Council to establish a workable attribution mechanism. We also passionately speak for today in this chamber. Let's make it happen and convert our words into real deeds. Kazakhstan delegation is ready for that and calls our colleagues to take an extra mile effort in this direction. I thank you.
Le agradezco al representante de Kazajstán por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Etiopía.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank the Secretary General for his briefing and deeply appreciate his efforts to weigh in on this great challenge we face to ensure what should and must be avoided will not happen because of miscalculation, lack of thoughtfulness, or lack of appreciation of the tremendous responsibility we bear, the Security Council bears, most particularly its permanent members. The Cold War is back with vengeance, the Secretary General said. This time, in a less managed manner, he wanted to tell us. It's very difficult to quarrel with him. His approach was quite comprehensive, focusing, as he said, on the multiplicity of dangerous conflicts the Middle East is facing. His approach might be better, but I choose to focus on Syria because it is the flashpoint currently. Mr. President, following the alleged chemical attacks in Douma, it's regrettable that the Council was not able to adopt a resolution to create an independent, impartial, and professional investigative mechanism to identify those responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This is a problem that has been with us for some time, a reality that sadly reflects the lack of unity in the Council, even on matters that are manifestly in the common interest of all. We indeed welcome the deployment of the OPCW fact-finding mission to Syria to establish the facts surrounding the alleged use of chemicals as weapons. We have repeatedly stated that using chemicals as weapons is inhumane, and we condemn the use of it by any actor under any circumstances. one matter remains, and that is putting in place a mechanism for attribution. One hopes this will be done the soonest. But that doesn't mean, in the meantime, we cease exercising maximum restraint in the interests of peace. Mr. President, pragmatic considerations and simple rational calculation suggests at present that we get our priorities right. We need to live to be able to fight evil. We have continued to express our deep concern about the current dynamics in Syria and its devastating implications for regional and international peace and security. We fully concur with the Secretary General, who stressed in his April 11 statement that it is vital to avoid the situation spiraling out of control. He has stressed this legitimate concern again today. The Security Council, as the principal body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, should not and cannot allow this to happen. At a time when we are talking about preventive diplomacy, as well as after electing a Secretary General who told us in his maiden speech to this Council that prevention is not merely a priority, but the priority. Now is the time for the UN to undertake the search for diplomacy for peace in earnest. If we are seriously committed to move this organization from the culture of reaction to prevention, now is the time to stand firmly, to speak in one voice, and take proactive and collective action that could be respected by all major stakeholders. This requires the Council to be united for global peace and security. We know this is difficult, but it's our conviction that we have no other sane option. This is in particular the time for the Security Council to stand up and be counted. The Security Council is the custodian of the Charter of the United Nations, which, growing out of the devastating Second World War, promised to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This is a clarion call the Council should heed and act upon. The situation should not be allowed to spiral out of control. He is right. The Council should listen to him, like the Secretary General is right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de Etiopía por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Países Bajos.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive and insightful briefing. His statement, rightly so, focused on the broader Middle East. However, I will focus my statement on the most pressing issue at hand, the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Mr. President, the UN Charter starts with the words, "We, the peoples of the United Nations." And while the Russian Federation is blocking effective action of this Council on the crimes of its ally, the Syrian regime, all peoples of every nation are outraged by the continued unlimited violence committed by the Syrian regime against its own people. As the Secretary General just said, the people of Syria have lived through a litany of horrors. No responsible government can ignore the universal outrage about these horrors. Our collective incapacity here in the Council to stop the crimes in Syria should weigh heavily on the conscience of all members of this Council. But especially, it should weigh heavily on the conscience of one permanent member. It is our collective conscience that created this Charter. It is our collective conscience that created the Chemical Weapons Convention. The use of chemical weapons is unlawful in and of itself. The use of chemical weapons is a violation of the UN Charter. And the use of chemical weapons is a serious violation of international law, may constitute a war crime and a crime against humanity. We strongly believe that the international community must fully uphold the standard that the use of chemical weapons is never permissible. As the Secretary General just said, the norm against the use of chemical weapons must be upheld. The non-proliferation regime must be upheld. Accountability for chemical weapon use in Syria, therefore, is neither optional nor negotiable. The images of last weekend's attack in Douma are appalling. Once again, atrocities have been inflicted on Syria's civilian population. Once again, dozens of innocent civilians were killed. Once again, hundreds of innocent civilians were injured. The Kingdom of the Netherlands believes it's highly likely that the Syrian regime is responsible for the attack. The Syrian regime has a proven history of such attacks in 2014, 2015 and 2017, when it used chemicals as a weapon against its own people. It is unacceptable that 4 years after Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, its declarations can still not be verified as accurate or complete. Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is a long-time supporter of fighting impunity when it comes to chemical weapons. Regrettably, all attempts to achieve accountability here at this Council have failed. Referral to the International Criminal Court was vetoed. Renewal of the mandate of the JIM was vetoed. And again this week, accountability was vetoed. With its vetoes, the Russian Federation has assumed a heavy responsibility for the crimes committed by the Syrian regime. Mr. President, the resolution for a new accountability mechanism that was struck by that veto this week remains the bare minimum of what is acceptable to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We will not settle for anything less than an independent, impartial attribution mechanism so that the culprits of this vicious attack will be identified and will be held accountable. Mr. President, no veto can wipe from our memory the clear conclusions presented by the JIM on the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime and by Daesh. Mr. President, no veto can stop our compassion for the victims of the chemical weapons attack this weekend. Mr. President, no veto can end our determination to achieve justice for the victims and to achieve justice for the people of Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands remains committed to fighting impunity. We reiterate our strong support for the international, impartial and independent mechanism, for the Commission of Inquiry, for the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons, and a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That is the most appropriate path to accountability and to justice. The heart of our policy on Syria is a deep desire for peace and justice for the Syrian people. Impunity can and will not prevail. And let me end with a warm word of appreciation for the Secretary General and his tireless efforts for justice and for the international legal order. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de Países Bajos por su declaración y le doy la palabra a la representante de Polonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Secretary General for his comprehensive briefing and assure him that he has our full support in finding political solution to any conflict, not only in Syria. While discussing the situation in the Middle East, and especially the current situation in Syria, let me begin with a very sad observation. Even with unanimously adopted Security Council resolutions, such as 2401, we are still lacking any substantial change on the ground. Fighting is far from being over and human suffering is tremendous. Taking into consideration the current situation and the growing risk of loss of human lives simply due to the lack of food or medicines, we should try to do our utmost to find possible ways to ensure that life-saving aid convoys may reach those in need. Unfortunately, this does not apply only to eastern Ghouta, but also to Idlib and Aleppo provinces. We have to find a way to alleviate the suffering of ordinary Syrians. The civilian population in Syria has already suffered too much. International public opinion observe our meetings and see our lack of agreement on the most basic principles arising from international humanitarian law. This Council bears extreme responsibility and we will be held accountable for its actions. Therefore, we call upon the Security Council to take necessary steps to ensure that all parties to the conflict, especially the regime and its allies, implement the ceasefire, enable humanitarian access and medical evacuations, and fully engage in the UN-led talks in Geneva in line with Security Council resolutions 2254 and 2012 Geneva Communique that represent the best path to peace. Mr. President, while talking about Syria today, let me turn to the chemical track. A century ago, use of chemical weapons was a normal way of waging wars. Just recently, we have commemorated 100 years since chemical weapons were used for the first time on the front lines of World War I, both in the West and East. French, British, American, and other Allied soldiers were targeted with chlorine in Ypres. Russian Empire soldiers were dying of the same gruesome weapons in Bolimów, now on the Polish territory. And now, a century later, we are being challenged by these ghastly weapons yet again. Our nations experience effects on the very same toxic gas which is now the face of civilians who sought refuge in cellars of Ghouta and other places in Syria. Once a remote history, chemical weapons were effectively banned by CWC in 1997. We turn a new page in the history on non-proliferation and disarmament. All of us at this table agree that use of chemical weapons by anyone and anywhere is deplorable and unacceptable. So, can we really allow to revert the success story of the CWC? Will the Security Council allow to ruin the vision of the world free of chemical weapons? It is regrettable that the establishment of an independent, impartial, investigating mechanism on the use of chemical weapons in Syria was vetoed on Tuesday, thus allowing those responsible for chemical attacks to remain unpunished. Accountability for such acts is a requirement under international law and is central to achieving durable peace in Syria. As members of the Security Council, we must find a way to come to an agreement on how to respond to chemical attacks in Syria properly. In this context, Mr. President, we commend the deployment of the fact-finding mission to Douma within the shortest possible time. We reiterate our appreciation to the Director General and to the OPCW staff for their commitment to the goals and work of the organization, often in particularly challenging circumstances. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Le agradezco a la representante de Polonia por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, la délégation ivoirienne remercie le secrétaire général, Monsieur Antonio Guterres, pour son exposé sur les derniers développements de la situation, généralement critique dans plusieurs pays du Moyen-Orient et notamment en Syrie, depuis l'examen de cette question par notre Conseil les 9 et 10 avril 2018. En dépit de la relative accalmie observée dans la poursuite des combats en Syrie, la situation humanitaire reste préoccupante dans un contexte d'allégations d'utilisation récurrente d'armes chimiques par les parties au conflit. En raison de ces divisions internes, notre Conseil, malgré sa bonne volonté, n'a pas réussi à faire appliquer la résolution 2401 que nous avions adoptée à l'unanimité afin d'apporter une assistance humanitaire aux populations en détresse. Face aux informations persistantes faisant état d'utilisation d'armes chimiques à Douma, le Conseil n'a pu s'entendre sur une déclaration à minima qui aurait permis, en ces moments difficiles, d'exprimer au peuple syrien notre solidarité. La délégation ivoirienne reste préoccupée par l'impasse actuelle dans laquelle se trouve le Conseil de sécurité, qui ne lui permet malheureusement pas de parvenir à un accord sur un mécanisme de lutte contre l'impunité en ce qui concerne l'usage d'armes chimiques en Syrie. Dans ce contexte, nous réaffirmons notre soutien à l'enquête impartiale, transparente et indépendante qui sera menée par la mission d'établissement des faits de l'Organisation pour l'interdiction des armes chimiques en vue de faire la lumière sur les allégations d'utilisation d'armes chimiques à Douma dans le Ghouta oriental. La Côte d'Ivoire réitère sa condamnation ferme de toute utilisation d'armes chimiques, quels qu'en soient les auteurs, en termes de paix comme de guerre. Elle exhorte à nouveau les membres du Conseil de sécurité à une unité d'action afin de mettre de côté leurs divergences et parvenir à la mise en place d'un mécanisme de reddition de comptes et astreindre les auteurs d'utilisation d'armes chimiques à répondre à leurs actes. Monsieur le Président, la Côte d'Ivoire reste préoccupée par les tensions nées de l'impasse politique actuelle et encourage le secrétaire général à utiliser ses bons offices auprès des parties prenantes pour ramener la paix et la sérénité afin de prévenir toute escalade de la présente situation. Dans cette optique, mon pays voudrait inviter toutes les parties à la retenue en vue de résoudre de façon pacifique cette question et préserver de la même occasion la paix et la sécurité internationale, notre bien commun. Monsieur le Président, la Côte d'Ivoire réaffirme sa conviction et sa position de principe, selon laquelle la solution à la crise en Syrie ne saurait être militaire. Elle doit plutôt être recherchée dans le cadre d'un dialogue et d'un processus politique inclusif, comme le prévoit la feuille de route de la résolution 2254 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Mon pays reste convaincu que seul le dialogue pourra nous permettre de trouver des solutions justes au conflit syrien. Je vous remercie.
Al representante de Côte d'Ivoire por su declaración. Paso ahora a formular una declaración en mi capacidad nacional. Queremos agradecer la presentación del secretario general Antonio Guterres y saludar su disposición a coadyuvar a alcanzar una salida al impasse en que se encuentra este Consejo. Lo alentamos a continuar desplegando todos los esfuerzos del caso conforme a las prerrogativas que le confiere la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. El Perú manifiesta su profunda preocupación por la división existente en este Consejo, en particular entre sus miembros permanentes, y por el lamentable uso del veto, que restringe nuestra capacidad para mantener la paz y seguridad internacionales y resolver los conflictos y crisis humanitarias que componen nuestra agenda. Observamos con alarma que el conflicto sirio sigue registrando crímenes atroces cometidos impunemente y que ha degenerado en una grave amenaza a la estabilidad regional y mundial al punto de producir serias tensiones. Respecto de las denuncias sobre un nuevo empleo de armas químicas en la localidad siria de Duma, consideramos necesario retomar, con carácter de urgencia y renovado espíritu de compromiso, negociaciones conducentes a garantizar el acceso pleno requerido por la misión de búsqueda de hechos de la Organización para la Prohibición de las Armas Químicas, OPAC, que se está desplegando en Siria para investigar lo sucedido, y crear un mecanismo dedicado, independiente, objetivo e imparcial de atribución de responsabilidades. En ese contexto, debemos recordar que no existe una solución militar al conflicto sirio, y cualquier respuesta a la barbarie debe ser conforme al derecho internacional y ajustarse estrictamente a lo establecido por la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Debemos asimismo recordar que mediante su resolución 2401, este Consejo ha dispuesto un alto al fuego humanitario vigente para todo el territorio sirio, y que es urgente avanzar en el proceso político de conformidad con la resolución 2254 y el comunicado de Ginebra. Como ha señalado el secretario general, son particularmente preocupantes los riesgos que el actual impasse implica, siendo indispensable evitar que la situación se salga de control. Esto no puede ocurrir cuando nuestro deber es poner fin al sufrimiento de millones de personas y a la impunidad con la que se cometen crímenes atroces. El Perú reafirma su compromiso con la alta responsabilidad que el mantenimiento de la paz y seguridad internacional supone. Mi delegación continuará trabajando por alcanzar una solución al conflicto y proteger a la población siria de conformidad con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y el derecho internacional. Muchas gracias. Vuelvo a asumir la función de presidente del Consejo. Recuerdo lo que establece la nota 507 de este Consejo sobre la extensión de las intervenciones, y ahora doy la palabra al representante de la República Árabe Siria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
بداية أقدم باسم حكومة بلادي التعازي
On behalf of my government, I would like to express our condolences to the people and government of Algeria for the tragic military plane crash that claimed the lives of 247 people.
ثانيا أرحب بمشاركة السيد الأمين العام في هذه الجلسة الهامة وأشكره على تلك الإحاطة الشاملة الدقيقة التي أظهرت بجلاء أنه كان مع آخرين في هذا المجلس ممن أدركوا عنوان هذه الجلسة فعلا
did understand the title of this session, and he spoke in the manner that is commensurate with the threats to international peace and security in light of the allegations and accusations against my country and its allies.
قال السيد السفير سفير السويد زميلي
Ambassador of Sweden said that the use of chemical weapons is a war crime.
وهذا الكلام صحيح.
This is
وأنا
true.
معه في ذلك.
I agree with him.
وحكومة بلادي موافقة
My
على هذا
government agrees to this.
ولكن ألا تعتقد معي زميلي العزيز
However, my dear colleague,
بأن الحرب
don't you think
نفسها هي
that
جريمة
war in itself is a
وينبغي
crime
وقفها
and needs to be
ومنعها؟
stopped and to be prevented?
ربما هذا يصلح كعنوان لفصل
Perhaps
قادم في كتاب
this
سيبري
would be a very
الذي
good title
يصدره معهد
in
السلام في
a
ستوكهولم.
book by the Peace
لعل
Institute
ذلك
in
يفتح آفاقا
Stockholm.
جديدة
The
للدول
Institute of
الأعضاء في
Cypri.
فهم
Maybe this
معنى أن
would
الحرب
explain to
جريمة.
the member states that war in itself is a crime.
زميلتي مندوبة الولايات
My
المتحدة
colleague,
الأمريكية
the representative of the United States,
قالت أن الأسلحة
said
الكيميائية
that
السورية
the
التي
Syrian
قتلت
chemical
المدنيين
weapons that killed the civilians
50 مرة استخدم
were
السلاح
used
الكيماوي هكذا
50
قال
times. That's what she said.
و50 مرة استخدم
And
السلاح
50
الكيماوي
times
أدت
chemical
إلى قتل
weapons
200
were
مدني.
used and it only killed 200
تخيلوا أن
civilians.
الحكومة السورية قد غيرت
Imagine this.
اتجاه
The Syrian government
الحرب الكونية الإرهابية التي تشن على بلادي
reversed the course of the global terrorist war against my country by killing 200 civilians only.
بعد أن استخدمت الكيماوي 50 مرة.
After having used chemical weapons 50
أليس هذا
times.
كلام هواة؟
Isn't this talk of
أليس
those who
هذا
are
كلام يصلح
amateurs?
لروايات الأطفال من نوع سوبرمان وتانتان؟
Is good for DC
هل
Comics,
هكذا يفكر استراتيجيو البيت الأبيض؟
Comics. Is this how the White House
بأن
strategizes?
حكومة ما
That a
تستخدم
certain
الكيماوي
government
50 مرة
uses chemical weapons
للتخلص من
50
200 مدني؟
times to kill 200 civilians?
هل هذا يعقل أيها السادة؟
How is this possible? How is this
ثم
logical?
كيف فات على زميلتي مندوبة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أن بلادها نفسها
did overlook
على
one
متن سفينة
important
كيبري
thing, that her own country
قد دمرت
on board
المخزون
of the
الكيماوي
Kipri
السوري
has
في البحر الأبيض
destroyed
المتوسط
our
هي
stockpiles
وسفن
in the
الدنمارك
Mediterranean
والنرويج.
along with ships by Denmark
وكيف
and Norway.
لم يقل لها خبراؤها في الوفد
Their
الأمريكي
own experts in
أن
the US
السيدة سيغريد
delegation
كار
should have told
قالت
her that
لكم
Miss
في هذا المجلس في
Sigrid
شهر
Kaag
حزيران
said in this
2014
chamber in June
أنه لم يعد
2014
هناك
that there
مخزون
are
كيماوي في
no
سوريا.
chemical stockpiles in Syria.
هل يمكن أن تكون الذاكرة قصيرة إلى هذه الدرجة؟
Could they have simply forgot all of this?
يخطئ أيها السادة من يعتقد أن الحشود
Those
العسكرية
who think that military
الغربية
force,
الضخمة
Western
في شرق
massive military
المتوسط
force in the Eastern Mediterranean
تعزى لعشق صوفي
is because there is
غربي
a Sufi Western
بحفنة من زعران
affection
الإرهاب في دوما.
towards those vile terrorists in
بالمناسبة هؤلاء
Douma.
الزعران تم إخراجهم إلى
Those vile
الشمال كما
terrorists
تعرفون
were chased out of the
وهم في
north, as you
طريقهم
are
إلى
aware, and they are now
السعودية
on their
ومنها إلى
way
اليمن.
to Saudi Arabia, and
سيتم
then
إعادة
they
تدويرهم
will be
كزعران
recycled into mercenaries
واستخدامهم
working
في
in
جبهات
Yemen,
أخرى من
and
بينها
they will
اليمن.
be used in other battlefields, including Yemen.
كلا الحشود العسكرية الضخمة في شرق المتوسط لا تستهدف تلك الحفنة من الإرهابيين الزعران بل تستهدف الدولة السورية وحلفائها. هذا هو العنوان الذي ينبغي أن نبحث به اليوم في هذه الجلسة. لم يرعب زميلتي السفيرة الأمريكية استخدام بلادها ل20 مليون جالون من العامل البرتقالي في فيتنام عام 1961 والذي أدى إلى مقتل وجرح 3 مليون فيتنامي 3 مليون وما زال حتى الآن كل سنة يولد 400 ألف مشوه طفل مشوه في فيتنام بسبب الأورنج ايجنت الذي استخدم آنذاك. ولم يرعبها قتل قوات بلادها للآلاف من السوريين في الرقة وقتل الآلاف من العراقيين في الفلوجة والموصل باستخدام الفوسفور الأبيض اللي هو شكل من أشكال السلاح الكيماوي. أليس هذا جريمة حرب يا زميلي سعادة السفير السويد؟ أريد أن أقرأ على مسامعكم ما قاله وزير دفاع بريطانيا الأسبق هندرسون. اسمع يا صديقي مندوب بريطانيا. وزير دفاع بريطانيا الأسبق هندرسون يتحدث عن استخدام بلاده والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية للفوسفور الأبيض في العراق. قال وأقتبس: من غير المعقول أن نقوم باحتلال بلد يعني العراق بهدف البحث عن أسلحة كيميائية وفي نفس الوقت نستخدم نحن سلاحا كيميائيا ضد هذا البلد. سيد الرئيس، يقول جورج أورويل الذي يحظى بمكانة أدبية وأخلاقية عالية في زمن الخداع يكون قول الحقيقة عملا ثوريا. إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم هي أن ثلاثاً من الدول دائمة العضوية تجر العالم بأسره من جديد نحو هاوية الحرب والعدوان وتسعى إلى تعطيل عمل هذا المجلس في صون السلم والأمن الدولي، وهو المبدأ الأساسي الذي اتفق عليه الآباء المؤسسون عندما اعتمدوا ميثاق الأمم المتحدة في سان فرانسيسكو بتاريخ 26 وهنا لا بد لي من إنعاش ذاكرة هؤلاء بما جاء في الفقرة الرابعة من المادة الثانية من الميثاق وأقتبس، وقد قرأها زميلي سعادة السفير بوليفيا ولكنني سأعيد قراءتها. يمتنع أعضاء الهيئة جميعا في علاقاتهم الدولية عن التهديد استعمال القوة أو استخدامها ضد سلامة الأراضي أو الاستقلال السياسي لأي دولة أو على أي وجه آخر لا يتفق ومقاصد الميثاق الأمم المتحدة. انتهى الاقتباس. إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم سيد الرئيس هي أن تاريخ هذه الدول الثلاث مبني على استخدام الأكاذيب والقصص الملفقة لشن الحروب بهدف احتلال الدول والسيطرة على مقدراتها وتغيير أنظمة الحكم فيها بالقوة. إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم أيها السادة هي أن العالم بأسره وهذا المجلس بالذات هم شهود على غزو واحتلال وتدمير للعراق بكذبة أمريكية حصلت في هذا المجلس منذ 14 عاما، وهم شهود على أن فرنسا قد استغلت هذا المجلس لتدمر ليبيا بحجة حماية المدنيين كما تتذكرون وتقضي على آفاق مستقبل شعب بأسره لا لشيء إلا لأن رئيسها آنذاك ساركوزي أراد التغطية على فساده المالي وهي قصة تعرفون ماذا يجري بشأنها اليوم. ومع ذلك ما زالت بعض الدول تنساق وراء نفس الأكاذيب التي تسوقها نفس هذه الدول سعيا لشن عدوان على بلاد سوريا. رحم الله تلك الأيام التي كانت فيها فرنسا في هذا المجلس ما زالت تحتفظ بسياستها الديغولية فرفضت عدوان الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا على العراق في هذه الجلسة. رحم الله تلك الأيام. اليوم فرنسا لم تعد ديغولية وانضمت إلى مصاف الدول التي تعتدي على دول أخرى.
launch aggressions against other countries.
إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم أيها الرئيس هي أن المجتمع الدولي لم ينبري إلى كبح جماح هؤلاء المتهورين الذين عرضوا العلاقات الدولية مرارا وتكرارا إلى كوارث ومصائب منذ تأسيس هذه المنظمة. ونخشى ما نخشى من أنه إذا لم يتداعى هذا المجتمع الدولي لإيقاف العبث الذي يمارسه هؤلاء المتهورون فإن ذلك سيؤدي حكما أيها السادة إلى وأد هذه المنظمة في ظروف مشابهة لتلك التي أدت إلى وأد سالفتها عصبة الأمم. إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم أيها السادة هي أنه بعد أن فشلت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا وفرنسا وأدواتها في منطقتنا نحن بتحقيق أهدافها في سوريا من خلال تقديم كافة أشكال الدعم للمجموعات الإرهابية المسلحة، نراها اليوم تطلق تغريداتها وتتباهى بلطف وذكاء وحداثة صواريخها وتتحدى الشرعية الدولية من على منبر هذا المجلس وترسل أساطيلها وطائراتها لتحقيق ما عجزت عنه أدواتها الإرهابية على مدى السنوات السبع الماضية. إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم سيد الرئيس هي أن الحكومة السورية قد حررت مئات الآلاف من المدنيين في الغوطة الشرقية من ممارسات المجموعات الإرهابية المسلحة التي كانت تتخذهم دروعا بشرية وتحاصرهم على مدى سنوات وتمنع عنهم المساعدات الغذائية والطبية وتتخذ من بيوتهم ومدارسهم ومشافيهم مقرات عسكرية لشن هجمات ضد 8 ملايين مدني في العاصمة دمشق
8 million civilians in Damascus. The truth that needs to be told today is that some reckless people are pushing international relations towards the abyss based on a fake video prepared by the terrorist white helmets based on instructions by Western intelligence.
إن الحقيقة التي يجب أن تقال اليوم سيد الرئيس هي أنه ومثل ما جعل ما يسمى التحالف الدولي من طائراته الحربية سلاحا جويا في خدمة داعش لعرقلة عمليات تقدم الجيش العربي السوري وحلفائه ضد هذا التنظيم الإرهابي فإنه أي التحالف الدولي قد جعل من الخوذ البيضاء
International Alliance made the White Helmets its media division that fabricates and falsifies in the benefit of this terrorist
لقد بادرت حكومة بلادي إلى دعوة منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيميائية
My government took the initiative to invite the OPCW to dispatch a fact-finding mission to visit my country and the alleged site of the incident. We provided all facilitation for the team to work in a transparent and accurate manner. They are supposed to start their work in a few hours. This invitation
تأتي من منطلق قوة وثقة
comes from our diplomatic experience and trust and power, and not because we are weak or afraid of any bullying or threats. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms the three governments threatening to use power in a flagrant violation of Article 1 of the UN Charter that identifies the purposes of the UN towards the maintenance of international peace and security and the suppression of acts of aggression and other breaches of the peace. Mr. President,
إن فهمنا جميعا باستثناء الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا وفرنسا
with the exception of the United States, Britain and France, we all understand that the Security Council is the body in charge with the maintenance of international peace and security and should stand against attempts to impose the law of the jungle and the rule of the powerful. But some member states think that the UN is just a business that works based on market rules and the supply and demand principle and exploiting the fate of peoples, or uses it as a podium for cheap shows and investing in more lies. This actually is a truth that disappoints peoples of the world. We're not reinventing the wheel here. The history of our relations with these countries is filled with agony, pain, and bitter experiences, and their very well-known aggressive and hawkish policies. What is another truth, and what is more important as shocking truth, is that the silence of the majority vis-à-vis these aggressive policies is not collusion, but it is out of fear from their political blackmail and arrogance and economic pressure and their aggression, as they do not blink when they go after anyone who tells the truth. In conclusion, Mr. President,
إذا اعتقدت أو فكرت هذه الدول الثلاث الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا وفرنسا
if they think
أنها قادرة على مهاجمتنا والاعتداء على سيادتنا فعندئذ لن يكون أمامنا من مفر سوى تطبيق المادة 51 من الميثاق التي تخولنا بالدفاع عن مشروع النفس
gives us the right to defend ourselves, the legitimate right to defend ourselves. This is not a threat. This is a promise. This is a promise. We would not let anyone attack our sovereignty. Why do I say this is a promise?
أقول هذا لأن الزعيم الأمريكي جورج واشنطن
because George Washington, the U.S. leader, said some very important words 200 years ago, or even more than 200 years ago. He said, and I quote,
هل أدلكم أيها السادة على صوت أقوى من دوي المدافع.
Shall I tell you about a sound that is higher than the sound of the cannons? It's the sound of the truth that emanates from the heart of a nation that wants to live free. End of quote.
نحن أيضا في سوريا
We
لدينا
in Syria also
شخصيات وقادة وزعماء مثل جورج واشنطن.
Like George Washington. and prominent personalities. And they are doing the same thing. They're protecting the unity and sovereignty of their own country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le doy las gracias al representante de la República Árabe Siria. No hay más oradores inscritos en la lista. Se levanta la sesión.
Most recent use of poison gas against the people of Douma was not his first, second, third, or even 49th use of chemical weapons. The United States estimates that Assad has used chemical weapons in the Syrian war at least 50 times. Public estimates are as high as 200. In the weeks after Assad's sarin gas attack last April that killed nearly 100 people, including many children, the regime used chlorine gas at least once and possibly as many as 3 times in the same area. Last November, just as the Joint Investigative Mechanism mandate expired, the regime attacked its people with sarin again in the Damascus suburbs. In January, Assad used at least 4 chlorine-filled rockets in Douma, and then he struck again last weekend. And thanks to Russia, there was no UN body to determine blame. But we know who did this. Our allies know who did this. Russia can complain all it wants about fake news, but no one is buying its lies and its cover-ups. Russia was supposed to guarantee that Assad wouldn't use chemical weapons, and Russia did the opposite. The world must not passively accept the use of chemical weapons after almost a century of their prohibition. Everything the United Nations stands for is being blatantly defied in Syria with the help of a permanent member of this Council. All nations and all people will be harmed if we allow Assad to normalize the use of chemical weapons. It is those who act to violate the prohibition of chemical weapons who deserve our condemnation. Those who act to defend it deserve our support. The United States and our allies will continue to stand up for truth, accountability, justice, and an end to the use of chemical weapons. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante de los Estados Unidos por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de China.
Mr. President,
我感谢古特雷斯秘书长所做的通报，高度赞赏秘书长先生在中东及叙利亚问题上所做的不懈努力。当前，叙利亚局势十分危急，正处于战与和的十字路口。中方对形势发展高度关注，对紧张局势可能升级深感忧虑。当务之急是对有关事件展开全面、客观、公正的调查，形成具有权威性的结论。中方一贯坚持和平解决争端，反对在国际关系中动辄使用武力或者威胁使用武力。绕开安理会采取单边军事行动，不符合联合国宪章的宗旨和原则，有悖国际法和国际关系的基本准则。叙利亚的主权、独立、统一和领土完整应该得到充分的尊重。
We call on the parties concerned to remain calm, exercise restraint, refrain from any move that may lead to further escalation of the situation, and solve the issue peacefully through consultation and dialogue. China is convinced that there is no military solution to the Syrian issue. The only way out is a political settlement. China supports the UN in playing an active role in safeguarding the authority and the standing of the United Nations and its Security Council. China calls on the international community to keep up its diplomatic efforts without wavering, stay the course to settle the Syrian issue politically without wavering, give full play to the role of the UN as the main mediator, and settle the Syrian issue comprehensively, justly, and properly without delay, pursuant to the thrust of the relevant Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, the people of the world yearn for peace. They oppose war. The situation in Syria bears on peace and stability in the Middle East and the world at large, and it bears on the credibility and authority of the Security Council. At a crucial juncture such as this one, the Security Council should rightfully discharge its sacred responsibility emanating from the UN Charter, act in line with the dictates of our times, build unity and consensus, and do its utmost to maintain peace, leave no stone unturned to avoid war, and live up to the trust and expectations of the international community. China is and has always been a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, and a defender of international order. China stands ready to continue our unflagging effort to safeguard peace and stability in the Middle East and the world at large in the spirit of being responsible to history and being responsible to the people of the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de China por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Francia.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie le secrétaire général des Nations Unies pour son intervention. Nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui afin d'évoquer les menaces à la paix et à la sécurité internationale soulevées par la situation en Syrie, 6 jours après le nouveau carnage chimique survenu le 7 avril à Douma. Depuis 7 années, la situation en Syrie constitue assurément une menace grave à la paix et à la sécurité internationale au sens de la Charte des Nations Unies. Le Conseil de sécurité l'a lui-même caractérisé comme tel de manière unanime le 27 septembre 2013, jour de l'adoption de la résolution 2118, à la suite des effroyables attaques chimiques déjà en Ghouta oriental. Le monde découvrait alors pour la première fois et dans l'horreur
Нам точно известно, что главарям сирийских вооруженных группировок отданы приказы начать наступление после возможной силовой акции. Неужели очередной виток хаоса затевается только ради этого?
Is the latest wave of chaos truly being unleashed only for the sake of that?
Предлог – предполагаемое применение отравляющих веществ в сирийском городе Дума 7 апреля. Достоверных подтверждений этому нет. Наши специалисты не нашли никаких следов использования отравляющих веществ. Жителям Думы об атаке неизвестно. Все сведения о якобы произошедшей атаке предоставлены антиправительственными силами, заинтересованными в подобном развитии событий.
Such a development of events.
У нас есть веские основания полагать, более того, даже есть информация, что имела место провокация с участием спецслужб некоторых стран. Мы об этом давно предупреждали. Это повторение сценария Хан Шейхуна в апреле прошлого года. Сирийское правительство, которому очевидно все это надо в последнюю очередь,
appeared to need all of this,
заявила о своей непричастности и направила запрос о срочном проведении инспекции на предполагаемом месте происшествия
conduct of inspections at the area of the alleged incident by the OPCW forces.
Совместно с российскими военными предоставила гарантии безопасности.
They provided security and safety guarantees.
Миссия уже приступает к работе в Сирии. Рассчитываем, что она сможет обеспечить подлинно независимый и беспристрастный характер расследования. Только Совет Безопасности имеет полномочия на международном уровне принимать решения о том, какие меры и в отношении кого могут быть приняты в связи с использованием химического оружия в Сирии.
In Syria.
Россия продолжает усиленно и планомерно работать над деэскалацией напряженности, возникшей в последнее время в международных отношениях. Мы предложили принять краткую резолюцию Совета Безопасности в поддержку инспекции миссии ОСХО в Думе. Однако она была безответственно заблокирована США, Великобританией и Францией. Таким образом, эти страны продемонстрировали незаинтересованность в расследовании. Единственная заинтересованность — свержение сирийского
is to oust the Syrian government and, more broadly, to deter and contain the Russian Federation. This has been clearly seen in other international and domestic political subjects, which are based on mystifications and conspiracy theories, at the heart of which each time you baselessly place the Russian Federation. What are you trying to achieve? Following the lengthy difficulties in clashes in Syria, large parts of that country have been stabilized. The political process is now afloat. Indicators of national reconciliation are coming to the fore.
Нанесен существенный урон террористам. Мы никогда не отрицали, что вы тоже внесли определенный вклад в выполнение этой общей для всех задачи. Но определенные породы террористов всегда приберегались вами для борьбы с режимом и продвижения своих геополитических приоритетов в регионе. Британская коллега все время спрашивает меня, что делает Россия для выполнения резолюции 2401 Совета
the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2401. I will
Моя
respond.
страна является
My
едва ли не
country
единственной,
is almost the
которая этим
only
занимается.
party to be
За
doing
время
this.
существования Астанинского процесса удалось
Over the
заменить
course of the
более
existence of the Astana
2500
process, more than
населенных пунктов.
2,500 residential areas saw peace brought to them as a result
Это
of
не
our
означает,
efforts.
что
This
они
does
стали
not
жертвой,
mean that
как
they
вы
became
выражаетесь, режима.
victims, as you say it, of the regime, as
Просто
you
с
say
помощью
it.
России и
With the
других
assistance
гарантов
of
они
Russia
наладили
and other
нормальные отношения
guarantors,
с
they
центральными
have
властями
established a
Дамаска.
normal relationship with the central
В
authorities
Сочи
in
был организован и
Damascus. In
успешно
Sochi,
проведен при
what was
поддержке ООН Конгресс
organized and
Сирийского
successfully
национального диалога.
conducted with UN support was a Syrian National Dialogue Congress.
А сколько городов и сел
How many
замерили
cities,
вы?
how many towns have you
Сколько
introduced
группировок
peace
вы
to?
убедили
How
присоединиться к
many groups
договоренностям о
have you
прекращении огня?
persuaded to join ceasefire agreements?
Для
In
разблокирования
order to
ситуации
break
в
the
Восточной
deadlock
Гуте с
in the
момента
situation
принятия
in Eastern
резолюции
Ghouta since the adoption
2401
of
с
Resolution
лидерами вооруженных
2401,
группировок
with the leaders
при
of armed
содействии
groups,
России
with
проводились
Russia's
сложнейшие
assistance,
переговоры.
painstaking negotiations were held.
Боевиков и членам их
The
семьи удалось
fighters
в
and members
полной
of their family
безопасности
were able
вывести из
to,
этого
with
района.
full conditions of safety and security, to be evacuated from
Мирные
that
жители
area.
наконец получили
Civilians
возможность
finally
избавиться
gained
от
an
многолетнего
opportunity
террора.
to cleanse themselves of many years of terrorism and rid
Посмотрите на
themselves
их
of such
неподдельную радость.
terrorism. And look at their unbounded joy.
Эти кадры есть.
There is this,
Просто
this
ваши СМИ
footage
их не
exists,
показывают.
but for some reason your media outlets are not showing it.
Вас не волновала судьба
You had no
узников боевиков
concern
Восточной
for
Гуте
the
из
fate
числа
of the
сторонников
hostages of
сирийского
fighters in
правительства.
Eastern Ghouta, those from among supporters of the Syrian government.
Боевики, ведя торг с властями об обмене пленными, убеждали, что
They're
удерживают
bargaining
от
with the
2 до
authorities
4
for an
тысяч
exchange
человек.
of hostages and said that they held 2,000 to 4,000
Теперь
people.
выясняется, что
And
их
now it is
намного
becoming
меньше.
clear that that number is far lower.
Люди погибли от
People
жестокого
died
обращения и
due
изнурительного
to
труда, роя
harsh
по приказу
treatment
своих
and
учителей
difficult
огромные
labor
тоннели.
with digging enormous tunnels for their torturers.
Вы опечалены тем, что
You
ваши
lament the
бородатые
fact
питомцы
that
отправились в
your
бесплатное туристическое
bearded
путешествие по Сирии.
pilgrims were sent for free-of-charge tourist excursions into Syria.
Вы потеряли возможность
You
на
lost an
каждом углу кричать о
opportunity
сотнях тысяч
each
людей в
time
осажденной Восточной
to
Гуте.
cry about hundreds of thousands of people in the besieged eastern Ghouta. Now they need to be helped in restoring normal living conditions, but now you are no longer interested in this. And that is because now that territory is under government control. Now it will be necessary to engage in an inconvenient discussion for you on the blockade in Foix and Kafraya. When did the last humanitarian convoy reach the area? When did you even look into this? When was the last time you even looked into this? It will be necessary to respond for and be held accountable for Raqqa, which was destroyed by the coalition. Mr. President, there is a dangerous development of events which is fraught with far-reaching ramifications for global security. And the full responsibility in this case will fall to the United States and their allies. It is most unfortunate that old Europe continues to lose face. We call upon the leaders
upon a dedicated mechanism to attribute responsibility for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, end of quote, following the end of the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, or JIM. I want to repeat today that the norms against chemical weapons must be upheld. And as I wrote in the same letter, and I quote, ensuring accountability for a confirmed use of chemical weapons is our responsibility, not least to the victims of such attacks. A lack of accountability emboldens those who would use such weapons by providing them with the reassurance of impunity. This in turn further weakens the norm proscribing the use of chemical weapons and the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a whole. I urge all members to act responsibly in these dangerous circumstances. And I appeal to the Security Council to fulfill its duties and not give up on efforts to agree upon a dedicated, impartial, objective, and independent mechanism for attributing responsibility with regard to the use of chemical weapons. I stand ready to support such efforts. End of quote. Increasing tensions and the inability to reach a compromise in the establishment of an accountability mechanism threaten to lead to a full-blown military escalation. In my contacts with you, especially with the permanent members of the Security Council, I've been reiterating my deep concerns about the risks of the current impasse and stressed the need to avoid the situation spiraling out of control. Mr. President, that is exactly the risk we face today, that things spiral out of control. It is our common duty to stop it. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing and the valuable information contained in which he shared with us. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements.
Doy la palabra
al representante de la Federación de Rusia. Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his briefing. Your participation and your assessments and the authoritative word as to your authoritative word about the situation that has unfolded is of great significance. We concur with you. In the Middle East, there are many wounds. But presently, what is most important is the situation, the largest wound is the situation around Syria, insofar as the negative repercussions thereof are fraught with global repercussions. 2 days ago, the world received news. News flew around the world about a threat from the United States to conduct a strike against the Syrian Arab Republic. Warnings to prepare for this were also addressed to the Russian Federation. Let us recall that Syria, at the invitation of its legitimate government, has the presence of Russian troops deployed to combat international terrorism.
Продолжаем наблюдать опасные военные приготовления к незаконной силовой акции в отношении суверенного государства в нарушении норм международного права. Не только применение силы, но и его угроза идет вразрез с уставом ООН. Именно это мы прослеживаем в последних заявлениях и действиях Вашингтона и некоторых его союзников. Наращивается воинственная риторика на всех уровнях, включая берегам Сирии стягиваются дополнительные силы и средства ВМС США и их союзников. Ощущение таково, что Вашингтон взял однозначный курс на раскручивание военного сценария в отношении Сирии. Этого допустить нельзя. Такое развитие событий чревато тяжелыми последствиями для глобальной безопасности, тем более учитывая размещение в Сирии российского военного контингента. Есть и те, кто с молчаливым одобрением наблюдает за опасными приготовлениями, заявляет о понимании мотивов Вашингтона или занимается прямым подстрекательством, становясь таким образом потенциальным соучастником возможной военной авантюры. У нас в Совете Безопасности есть любители рассуждать о превентивной дипломатии. Почему-то сейчас их не видно, не слышно. Немедленно, еще не только до расследования, но и до установления самого факта инцидента, назначены виновные, которым предстоит, видимо, понести наказание. За развитие событий по неблагоприятному сценарию придется отвечать, как и за предыдущие интервенции, погрузившие ряд стран на долгие годы в пучину кризиса и приведшие к неисчислимым жертвам. Перед глазами недавний опыт Ирака и Ливии. Он, среди прочего, показывает, что к Совету Безопасности у американских партнеров сугубо потребительское отношение. Совет им нужен как прикрытие иракских пробирок или ливийской бесполетной зоны. Такую же виртуальную, пустую пробирку вы демонстрируете нам сейчас. Безответственное поведение США, попирающих международное право и суверенитет государств, недостойно статуса постоянного члена Совета Безопасности ООН, недостойно для статуса постоянного члена Совета Безопасности ООН. Он предполагает высочайшую ответственность, а не отсутствующее в Международном кодексе поведения право размахивать дубинкой. За что вы так терзаете Ближний Восток, провоцируя один конфликт за другим и натравливая региональные государства друг на друга? Кто выиграет от возможного удара по сирийским военным, несущим основное бремя борьбы с терроризмом, с террористами и добившимся серьезных побед в этом отношении?
Chemical weapons-related death in Syria. Sir, in the light of those seeking to sow confusion, going so far as to accuse the Syrian people themselves of having gassed themselves, in the light of those suggesting conspiracy theories, those endeavoring methodically to destroy our methods of instruments of action on chemical weapons in Syria, in the light of all of this, we must return to simple facts. Yes, the situation, the crisis in Syria constitutes a threat to international peace and security. This threat is related to the repeated, organized, systematic use of chemical weapons by the Bashar al-Assad regime, which once again crossed the threshold of horror with two attacks perpetrated in Douma on 7 April last. These attacks, which claimed the lives of several dozen people at least, and wounded hundreds of others, these victims many of these victims will continue to suffer throughout their lives the respiratory and neurological after-effects, which are very serious. There is no doubt as to the responsibility of Damascus in this attack. Facts were collected on the ground. There are symptoms of the victims, the complexity of the use of the substances, as well as the determination of the regime forces to, as expeditiously as possible, using every means at their disposal to cause the last pockets of Duma of resistance to yield. All point to this. This has been documented and confirmed. An independent mechanism was created at the initiative of the Security Council. It had already established at least 4 times since 2015 that there was chemical weapons used by the Damascus regime in Sarmin, in Talmenes, in Kmenas, and in Han Sheikhun. An investigative mechanism which a permanent member of the Security Council decided last November to force into silence. Mr. President, the chemical policy of the Bashar al-Assad regime is among the most blatant violations and most serious violations of all the norms which guarantee our collective security. A violation, firstly, of all international obligations vis-à-vis prohibition of chemical weapons under the OPCW, to which Syria is a party. Second, this constitutes a violation of the very foundations of international humanitarian law, namely the principles of distinction, of precaution, and of proportionality. Third, this constitutes a breach of successive Security Council violations 2118, 2209, 2235, and thereby a breach of the obligations incumbent upon Syria under the UN Charter. And lastly, the use of chemical weapons against civilians was banned in 1925 under the Geneva Protocol. This constitutes a war crime under the International Criminal Court statute. The United Nations Secretary General in August 2013 called chemical weapons use a crime against humanity. This chemical weapons war is a tool to accelerate a deliberate policy of submission through terror. This is a policy which, over the course of 7 years, has claimed the lives of 400,000 people, led to the deliberate destruction of civilian and health infrastructure in entire regions, caused a mass exodus of refugees and displaced people, and this has played into the hands of international terrorists. This bleak picture is among the gravest threats to international peace and security of the contemporary era. It is also the result of those and a consequence of the actions of those who continue to support it. Taking all means necessary. Once again, I wish to point to something evident. If Syria continues to use toxic substances for military purposes, this means that it has preserved the capacity to use and manufacture them. This is a breach of its international commitments. This is a breach of the guarantees delivered by Russia under the 2013 Russo-American Agreement and a breach of Security Council resolutions. So for a number of years now, the OPCW has informed us as to major persistent doubts vis-à-vis the sincerity of the initial declaration of Syria to the organization in 2013. Many of the questions and the requests set forth by the OPCW have been left without response. Syria has never provided a satisfactory explanation to the fact that inspectors discovered substances and capacities which Syria had previously never declared. These capacities have once again been seen by us in action on 7 April. They were used to kill the greatest possible number of civilians, used to terrorize survivors, and used to entrench the definitive reconquering of Duma by the Syrian regime beyond Syria. This impunity has lasted since 2013. It affects the whole of the chemical weapons non-proliferation regime, and with it, the entire security system which collectively we forged since the Second World War. It is this legacy of collective security that has been been built to protect succeeding generations from the scourges of violence and after two world wars. This is what members of the Security Council have been mandated to safeguard. Without it is necessary to act to chemical weapons. Otherwise, the genie of non-proliferation will emerge from its bottle. And the consequences of this will be paid by all of us. Mr. President,
le Conseil de sécurité, auquel la Charte des Nations Unies confie la responsabilité principale du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale,
assigned by the United Nations Charter with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security on behalf of the whole of the international community, is more than justified today in convening. It is more than justified once again to observe that there has been a violation of international law, of its own resolutions, and that there are persistent, proven threats to international peace and security. It is more than justified to urgently restore a mechanism for attribution of responsibility in chemical weapons attacks. The opportunity was once again provided in vain on Tuesday. The opportunity was provided on Tuesday with the draft resolution proposed by the U.S. It is more than justified to do what has been assigned to it, that is to take measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. In the light of the mass atrocities perpetrated in Syria, action of the Security Council has for a number of years been paralyzed by successive Russian vetoes. 12 times the Russian Federation exercised vetoes on Russia, 6 times on the chemical weapons dossier. The aim of these vetoes of these states immediately to reconsider, to return to the international legal fold, and not to bring the world to such a dangerous threshold. It is necessary to urgently seek a peaceful settlement through collective efforts. The Russian Federation stands ready to engage in equitable cooperation with all partners to resolve the problems which arise through dialogue. We steadfastly have focused on a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Syria on the well-known international legal basis, and we shall continue our proactive efforts to this end. We call upon all to follow suit, all of our partners to follow suit. Thank you.
Le agradezco al representante de la Federación de Rusia por su declaración y le doy la palabra a la representante de los Estados Unidos.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I started to listen to my Russian friend and respond, but instead, I'm in awe, Vasily, of how you say what you say with a straight face. I really, really am. Today's session of the Security Council has been called under truly strange circumstances. The Russian Federation has asked us to discuss what it calls unilateral threats related to Syria. What is strange is that Russia is ignoring the real threat to international peace and security that has brought us all here. And it is ignoring its own unilateral responsibility for all of it. What we should discuss today is the use of deadly chemical weapons to murder innocent Syrian civilians. That is one of the most blatant and grotesque violations of international law in the world today. It is a violation of all standards of morality. It violates the long-standing international consensus that chemical weapons represent a unique evil. Chlorine, mustard gas, and other chemical weapons killed 90,000 people and injured over 1 million in World War I. In the book, Canada in the Great World War, the Canadian soldier, A.T. Hunter, described it like this, quote, "The gas cloud gathered itself like a wave and ponderously lapped over into the trenches. Then passive curiosity turned to active torment, a burning sensation in the head, red-hot needles in the lungs, the throat seized by a strangler. Many fell and died on the spot, the others gasping, stumbling, with faces contorted, hands wildly gesticulating and uttering hoarse cries of pain, fled madly through the villages and farms and through the city itself, carrying panic to the remnants of the civilian population and filling the roads with fugitives of both sexes and all ages." End quote. Chemical weapons didn't produce the most casualties in World War I, but they were the most feared. In World War II, chemical weapons were employed on an industrial scale against civilians, resulting in the worst genocide in human history, which we recalled just yesterday on Holocaust Remembrance Day. That is what brings us here today. That is what chemical weapons are all about. That is why we must not stay silent in the face of horrible chemical weapons use in our own time. The first response to all this death and injury was the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of chemical weapons in war. Later, in 1993, the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed. That convention obligates all of its parties to, quote, never under any circumstances develop, produce, stockpile, transfer, or use chemical weapons. It also prohibits all parties from assisting anyone to engage in these activities. The United States is a party to this convention. Russia is a party to this convention. Every country that is a member of the United Nations Security Council is a party to this convention. Even the Assad regime has pledged to abide by the convention. So in theory, all of us agree on the core principle at stake today. No country can be allowed to use chemical weapons with impunity. Now that we have established what we all agree on, let's ask ourselves, what should we be condemning today? We should be discussing the actions that really brought us to this moment in time. We should not be condemning the country or group of countries that might actually have the courage to stand up in defense of our common principle, the principle against the use of chemical weapons. Instead, we should be condemning the country that unilaterally has stopped the Security Council from upholding this principle. Who is it on the Council that most exhibits unilateralism when it comes to chemical weapons? It is Russia alone that has stopped at nothing to defend the Syrian regime's multiple uses of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that killed the Joint Investigative Mechanism, which allowed the world to ensure accountability for chemical weapons use in Syria. It is Russia alone that used its veto 6 times to prevent the condemnation of Assad's use of chemical weapons. It is Russia alone that used its veto 12 times to protect the Assad regime. And to make matters worse, it is Russia alone that had agreed to be the guarantor of the removal of all chemical weapons in Syria. If Russia had lived up to its commitment, there would be no chemical weapons in Syria, and we would not be here today. That is the Russian record of unilateralism. It is a record that has led to the trashing of all international standards against the use of chemical weapons. This meeting should not be about the so-called unilateral threats. It should be about the multiple actions Russia has taken to bring us to this point. Our president has not yet made a decision about possible actions in Syria. But should the United States and our allies decide to act in Syria, it will be in defense of a principle on which we all agree. It will be in defense of a bedrock international norm that benefits all nations. Let's be clear. Assad's most